Ladies and gentlemen, today is May the 15th, 2022, and we are about to begin world discussion with Agent Smith. Smith. Where is he? He's in this channel. After them. We're going to talk about the world, foreign policy, economics, current events, history. If you have any questions, tag me and ask. If you have any questions or corrections in the YouTube comments or whatever, feel free to share. We are just two people talking about stuff. We're not official experts about something. It's meant to be a friendly conversation, so if we get stuff wrong, please give your feedback and let us know. Agent Smith.
Hey, how are you?
Pretty heckin' good. How are you?
Doing all right. Can't complain.
Do you need help complaining?
No. Got my tea, got my water. I'm doing good. What more can you want?
$1 million.
Yeah, that'll buy a lot of tea.
Yeah. A supercar. Oh,
Well,
chat.
supercars are expensive. Even if you get it for free, the maintenance is pretty steep.
Yeah, true. But they're
That doesn't
awesome.
even get into. Well, yeah, that's. If you're just going for awesome, though, you can rent one.
Yeah, that's also true. You can also lease them. That was one of the things that, what was his name? Ty Lopez. He was super good at that, of like leasing a super expensive mansion, leasing a bunch of supercars, and it looked like he owned all that stuff. And it was like he's the success story who's going to tell people how to make big money and be successful and things like that, where he was basically finding the cheapest possible way to have that stuff around him to create the illusion of wealth. And since it's going to get some people, he maybe made some legit money as a result of that. But yeah, it's true. You can certainly flex and find some economical ways to get some of the very expensive stuff around you.
Yeah, that's the way to do it. Much cheaper.
For a funny question to start off with, the chat was wondering if you've played the Stellaris DLC.
Oh, the new one?
Yes.
Not yet. Yeah, I did. Actually, I forgot to buy that before I started the new game today. It slipped my mind. Yeah, well, what happens with Stellaris is that you'll play it, it's fun, and then invariably they'll have like a big update. Because if you're like me, you don't play very often. And so you'll jump in, and then the new update, the new version will kind of scramble your old game. And so part of the game is kind of dealing with that. For the first time, I just reset it to the previous version. I finally just learned how and just did that. Before I would just try to adjust as best I could.
Yeah.
But no, I haven't played the new DLC yet.
They were saying that it's kind of expensive.
$20, yeah. It's generally better to get them on sale. Although they did have a lot of free stuff in the newest update. Because at the same time they released the DLC, they also released the newest version, and they updated a bunch of stuff. So that's pretty cool.
Nice.
A little freebie there.
I've been having a heckload of fun with Dota 2. Been playing a lot of that. I finally had my upswing from StarCraft after having a huge downswing learning this new keyboard. It was very humbling. It's pretty different. People were asking how different it is. I use an unorthodox, very custom hotkey layout for StarCraft, so my left hand, which is the keyboard hand, is more kind of in the middle to the right of a keyboard rather than on the left-hand side. And it's tilted at an angle, and I use my thumb to press shift and control at the same time. And learning the new keyboard with different size keys and different spaces, it was just like a bunch of inaccurate fumbling that I was doing as I'm slowly getting used to it, because I can't look at my computer screen and the keyboard at the same time. So it's kind of a trial and error process of just getting out all of those mistakes. And yeah, it was very brutal because I basically went down 2 leagues of skill from being someone who's steadily mid-grandmaster to being not Masters 1 but Masters 2, so I went down like 2 full brackets. And it was to the point where I had a couple people like accuse me of intentionally smurfing, like tanking my account rating, when I was just legit unable to perform with the new keyboard. Like no tomfoolery or mischief about it. It's just something that's really hard to do. For some examples, it would kind of be like a military person trying to use a new gun, or a swordsman trying to use a new blade that has a different weight to it. You're not going to be anywhere close to as effective just because it's not memorized yet. You need to have that muscle memory of where everything is, how much you have to move, how it feels, how much force you have to apply. And then all the keys on top of that, they have different switches, which means I need to push down with a different amount of force than previously.
Yeah.
But I finally, on Thursday, had that big upswing, and we just crushed people, and it felt like I know how to do this now. I don't need to think about the key presses as much, and it was way cleaner, and swung right back in GM, felt pretty amazing. And it was a good showcasing, and when you have a known downswing because of a change, and then you know that the upswing's going to happen, but it always happens later than you would like it to. Learning is painful.
Unfortunately so. It takes time to burn those pathways.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'm glad things are looking up.
Hell yeah. Not only that, but our heckin' classic BC guild is beast. We had the new raid content, which is out, and it's the toughest of this whole expansion, and we just shattered the expectations that we had. We expected to get stuck on the second boss for a pretty long amount of time, and we beat it in like 4 tries. And it's one of those, like, just a very burly power check. It doesn't really have a bunch of fancy running around. It's just, do you have thick enough tanks with strong enough damage dealers and powerful enough healers to do all the basic stuff? And we heckin' did. And that was beast. And then we got the third boss down pretty fast. And yesterday we progressed on the 4th boss, and today we killed it. And then we started progressing on the 5th boss, and there are 6 total, with the 5th being the most difficult. So I'm guessing we'll probably have the place cleared, not next week, but the week after, or the week after that. But it's really fun content. It's actually a challenge. And I think whenever you have something that's more challenging, it makes the victory a lot more fun. Like, you're more proud of a difficult win than you would be over kind of a walkover.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that the classic WoW game, I think, did pretty well in some categories where they really make you work for stuff. It takes a lot of preparation, a lot of teamwork, and just people knowing what their jobs are and having a lot of synergy with each other to be successful. So I'm hella proud of the guild. I think we're 34th on the server, and we're on one of the biggest horde servers that's around. So yeah, definitely a massive step up from where our guild started, which was more of a dad guild, more casual, just happy to be there, cool to see the content, but we weren't really crushing stuff. But for these bosses, if you don't have people who really know their class and really play well, you just can't physically kill them. So it felt like a really distinguishing weekend for us.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Congrats.
Thank you.
Sounds like a pretty rewarding week overall.
Yeah, it's been an awesome up week for me, for sure. Chat also wanted to know if you did your walk.
I did last week.
Good job. Yeah, I don't think we did Agent Smith last week because I went to a concert.
Oh, cool.
I saw Opeth.
I have no idea who that is, but I'm sure it was fun.
It's a good Swedish metal band.
Oh, really? Yeah, they have a lot of metal bands up there in Scandinavia, don't they?
They do. Very high per capita. Norway, Sweden, Finland. That's like one of the main professions. The
Not
joke
Denmark?
is Denmark has a good bit, but it's not quite as cold and frostbitten. And that's the thing, is if the location is cold and frostbitten, you have easy content that's like really metal to write lyrics about. And then also the weather is so bad that you might as well stay inside and practice your guitar riffs. So
There you go.
Another quick question before I start diving into games. Did you see the election of Marcos Jr. in the Philippines and
I
the
did.
implications for China-related policy?
Probably not much. Some people online were making a big deal about him being anti-American or pro-China, but really, if he's as corrupt as his critics say he is anyway, then he's probably for sale. So I imagine Washington could win a bidding war if it came to that.
Mm.
So we'll probably be fine. The Philippines might be in for a rough patch. Uh, if he's as corrupt as his family was when they were in power back in the, what, 70s and 80s, then there could be a fair amount of graft. But it's not as though there wasn't already at least some corruption in the Philippines, so it's not necessarily going to be a big step up. So yeah, not a great outcome. I'm sure a lot of people in the Philippines, especially in the urban areas, would have preferred, and especially in the diaspora, would have preferred to have the reformist candidate win. She had pretty good credentials too, so it
Mm.
stings even more, but it's not the end of the world either. It's basically going to be probably more or less more of the same. It's kind of Duterte 2.0, so to speak, rather than
Mm.
something totally new or a full reversion to the dictatorship days.
Was this
But
person as edgy?
as edgy as who?
Duterte?
No,
Okay.
I don't think so.
So
You know,
similar, but in alignment, but not in style.
yeah, different style. Duterte was just he was a very Trump style figure in the sense that he used rhetoric very aggressively.
Mm-hmm.
Telling women that, what was it? There was at least one female journalist. He said that he wouldn't rape or that he would have rape, something like that. I don't quite remember the details. It's been a couple years. But there was also, the drug thing, where he said that he would kill drug addicts. And, there was some effort at that. There was certainly an uptick in deaths, but it's not clear how much of that was policy versus how much of it was just a sense of impunity.
A
Uh,
casual way of saying that would be he talks shit.
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
He did a lot of that. So I don't think Marcos does that as much. His thing is more nostalgia. He
Mm.
talks more about how the Philippines was more prosperous and more stable when his father was in charge, and that if they voted for him, then he would return the Philippines to those halcyon days of yore.
Mm. Golden age
Probably,
fallacy.
yeah, yeah. So it probably won't happen. I'm not sure what he would do differently that would cause that. I mean, the Philippines has such basic structural problems afflicting its economy and political culture. And I don't see Marcos as doing anything to really address that, or address any of those, rather. But we'll see. I mean, for the United States, the principal implications are going to be foreign policy wise.
Mm-hmm.
And from what I've read, for all of the rhetoric he's issued, he won't necessarily follow that up with a complete break with the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe there will be some rhetoric, maybe he'll try to leverage this, that, or the other issue to get something out of the US, but probably won't work. Well, I
Yeah.
mean, it'll work. I mean, I'm sure Washington will play ball with him, but it's not going to work in the sense that it's going to completely detach the Philippines from the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And it's worth mentioning too that Duterte himself, really appealed to China in order to try to play the United States and China off of each other in order to kind of get something from both. I remember Duterte at one point actually traveled to Beijing and announced that he was in China's sphere of influence. That
Mm.
is to say, the Philippines was in China's sphere of influence. And so there was some, talk, some concern that maybe the Philippines was drifting away from the United States and that this would be a major break in relations, but it never really played out like that. Instead, the Philippines largely maintained existing institutional ties. There was no major foreign policy break, and China, for its part, really did not engage that much with him. There was a lot of skepticism on their part. I don't think they really ever saw, that is to say, in Beijing, I don't think the Chinese government really ever saw Duterte or the Philippines in general as sort of viable partners. There was some investment from the Belt and Road Initiative. And I know there was like a big uptick in private sector investment, in particular in the tourist sector. There's a big uptick in Chinese tourists going there. But beyond that, Duterte's entreaties were not really reciprocated. And so those relations largely stagnated over the course of his administration. So it seems that even if you really go hard and push for Chinese investment and resources and whatnot, you're not really going to get a lot in return, at least not if you're the president of the Philippines anyway. So neither the United States nor China, that is to say, neither the Philippines' foreign policy towards China or the United States seems likely to change all that much if you look at the details.
Mm.
So again, the principal implication is going to be for the Philippines itself and its political culture, and especially for the health of its democracy. That's sort of more what I would be concerned with and more what I'll be watching. But as far as foreign policy, I don't predict any substantive changes given what I know now.
So one of the old we'll see. Words are very cheap.
Yeah.
That's another thing too, is oftentimes you can sort of, it's like whatever the opposite of pandering is. I guess it is still a kind of pandering where you bash certain countries or groups in a way to drum up support from certain people in your base. But then later you can go apologize or do other stuff that makes yourself more amenable to them, and they may not have noticed that. Like your base may have already been satisfied that you were so tough in like talking to this or that group, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, he talks big. He tries to appeal to Filipino nationalism and pride, but there's not a lot underneath that from what I've seen thus far.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe he'll surprise us, who's to say, but I'm a little skeptical. He's very much a manifestation of the populist moment we live in, globally speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning too that his principal running mate, not vice president per se, they kind of have a different system in the Philippines. The vice president actually runs in a separate election from the president, but the president has like a deputy who runs with him. And the deputy that Marcos chose was actually the daughter of Duterte, Sara Duterte. So that suggests there's some kind of alliance there, at least of some sort, which also suggests that there's probably going to be some continuity policy-wise between the Duterte administration and the Marcos administration. And I would point out too that Marcos's father, when he was dictator of the Philippines during the Cold War, was a pretty reliable American ally, even though there was obviously a lot of issues with corruption and whatnot. So I don't know why the United States could not have a similar arrangement with his son if it came to that. I still don't think we're going to get that naval base back, though.
Hmm.
Yeah, I don't. What was it called? Do you remember what it was called?
The name of the naval base?
Yeah, the United States had a huge naval base in the Philippines for decades, for a very long time. I think we even had it like back before World War II, even. And I'm sure somebody in chat knows. There has to be somebody who knows somebody who served there because we didn't leave it until I think the early 90s. It was after the Cold War was kind of I think it was after the Cold War ended. Also, there was a huge ass volcano that that erupted. That may have had something to do with it too. But I
Subic
think they
Bay?
were. What was it?
Subic Bay?
Yeah, I think that's it. That sounds right.
U.S. Navy ships still call it Subic Bay on the island of Luzon, about 50 miles from Manila.
Yeah, they still call, but we don't have the facilities anymore.
Mm-hmm.
There's actually, we were there for so long, and we had so many military presence at that base that there's actually a kind of residual demographic impact on the area around the base because there were so many servicemen. Well, you know how it is with military bases, right? Like there's always crime and prostitution like around the base to some degree at least. And one of the things that would happen around Subic Bay is that servicemen would go and, maybe cheat on their wife, or if they don't have a wife, they would go and avail themselves of the services of the local women, shall we say. And one of the results of that is that there was a lot of mixed race births that came out of that. And unfortunately, there was a lot of cases where the fathers would basically just abandon the family if they were leaving the service or went back to the States or whatever.
Hmm.
And so there's actually a pretty decent number of mixed race children that live in and around the old base just because of that interaction there. It's kind of an interesting example of a demographic, an explicit demographic manifestation of cultural exchange.
Hmm.
Yeah, the Philippines has a lot of that. It's a very diverse country that's had a long history being colonized by different countries, but also being influenced by its neighbors. So the culture there is very, very unique. It's just a whole hodgepodge of different influences all interacting with each other.
Yeah, they speak Tagalog, which
Mhm.
has some straight up Spanish words. And the way that I can recognize it, I don't speak Tagalog, is I'll hear something that sounds like an Asian language, and then I'll hear a Spanish word mixed in. I'll be like, ah, I know that one.
Yeah, the Philippines was colonized by the Spanish for several centuries before the United States got a hold of the territory after the Spanish-American War. And so there's a lot of Spanish influence on the culture there. Catholicism is the most obvious example, but also language, like you point out as well, if not also customs and whatnot. Machismo is definitely a big part of Filipino culture.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think there's one peninsula in Mindanao. It starts with a Z. I don't quite remember the full name, but on that peninsula, there's actually Spanish speakers. I don't think it's even like a Creole. I think they just straight up speak Spanish there. It's like a very small ethnic group. That's sort of one of the last vestiges of substantive Spanish influence there. Yeah, Mindanao is weird. They don't, Mindanao has most of the country's Muslims, which I think make up like something like 15 to 20% of the population, something like that. So they're in Mindanao, the Spanish speakers are in Mindanao, and then there's also some residual Japanese influence in Mindanao. Uh, everybody knows that the United States fought Japan in World War II, and that kind of unfortunately sort of erased the memory of broader Japanese influence in the region. When people think about Japanese influence in the Pacific, uh, they generally think about, at least in the 20th century, they'll think about, the war and the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. But before World War II, there was a lot of peaceful influence, like a lot of economic and demographic influence. So, for example, in the Philippines, the United States, the way the United States ran the Philippines, it was relatively open to foreign investment, not just American investment. And so there was actually a pretty decent amount of Japanese investment, especially in the South, in Mindanao. And they set up a bunch of plantations around the city of Davao, which I think is the capital of Mindanao. I'm not sure, I can't quite remember. But anyway, there was a number of Japanese that went there to the point where there was a significant number of Japanese citizens who actually lived in the city before the war. They had a pretty significant influence on the local culture. Because of the events of the war, obviously, most of those people ended up leaving later on. But there had been some intermixing between some of the Japanese and the local Filipino population, and some of those mixed couples and mixed and their children stayed on even after the war. So there's still some, you can still see some people there that look surprisingly Japanese, basically. It's a little unusual. And then there, of course, there's a lot of Chinese influence historically. There was a number of Chinese merchants that set up the city of, well, it wasn't a city then, but they set up what is now the city of Manila as a trading post, an intraport. And as a result, there's a lot of genetic Chinese influence, I guess you could say, on the local population in the north,
Hmm.
if not also in the broader part of the country. Yeah, just a very diverse country, just lots of influences there. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, it seems like a melting pot kind of place
Hmm.
within the Asia Pacific region.
Yeah. And even unto itself, there's a lot of diversity. Like there's lots of different Filipino languages, ethnic groups, whatnot. All the different islands basically have their own ethnic group.
Hmm.
It's uh, it's pretty neat. It's fun to study it. It's hard to it's hard to internalize all of it because there's just so much diversity. It's hard to kind of memorize all of it, but yeah, it's fun to take a look at some of the differences there. Yeah, I think I remember reading that the center of the Philippines is distinctive from the south and Mindanao, and both of them are distinct from sort of Luzon in the north. I think Luzon is a little more homogenous because that's sort of where the largest ethnic group lives. And then in the south, it's kind of the hodgepodge I mentioned. But then in the center of the country, you have those five islands there. Don't ask me what they are. I don't remember. One of them is Cebu, I think. Or is it Cebu? I'm never sure about the pronunciations of Filipino names. But there's also, I think Negros was one of them. And then there was Iloilo. Maybe that was the city. But those islands were actually the first place the Spanish landed in the Philippines, and those were the first places to be colonized. And so Catholicism, I think I read that Catholicism there is more deeply rooted, because I think the first diocese was supposed to have been set up there or something like that. Somebody more familiar with their Filipino history would know better than I would. It hasn't been a major object of study for me. I think I also remember that Cebu was supposed to be like the commercial center. Well, obviously, Manila is going to be the commercial center, but as far as regional culture and whatnot, Cebu is very commercial. It has a much stronger economy and business culture than some of the other regions. Anyway, that's a tangent. Sorry.
No, it's all good. We are learning about the Philippines. I don't really know too much about it. My second roommate in college was half Filipino, and they went to a Church of Christ, which is kind of like a more extreme offshoot of Christianity that does some things kind of different and weird. They were really particular about going to church on Wednesdays, not just the usual Sunday, and they had to be really dressed up. And I didn't really know a ton about it, but it was a big part of the different pressures that were imposed on my friend. And one of the reasons why in the next university we went to, which we were roommates again, he wanted to kind of cut loose and party and breathe free more because of how restrictive that group's kind of rule set was.
Yeah.
Yeah, his mom was Filipino ethnically, and his dad ended up joining the church and that kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a huge number of Filipinos that migrated over to the US over the course of the past 100 years or so. So they make up a disproportionately large proportion of the Asian American population here, especially on the West Coast where they're mostly concentrated. And that was actually one of the controversial things about colonial Philippines, specifically the U.S. management of the Philippines as a colony. One of the major sources of opposition to the U.S. holding of the Philippines, the U.S. imperialism in the East Pacific, not the East Pacific, but rather the South and Southeast Asia. One of the major sources of opposition to that was labor in the United States, because a lot of workers in the United States didn't like the idea of a bunch of Filipino workers coming over and pushing wages down. And so they were very critical then of some of the pro-imperial people in U.S. politics that wanted to hold on to the Philippines for the long term and maybe also expand elsewhere. So that's actually one of the reasons that the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s agreed to a timeline for independence for the Philippines. That was a way of basically giving his supporters what they wanted, basically separating the Philippines from the United States and preventing free migration of workers from the Philippines. We still ended up with quite a few. And we actually still receive a lot of nurses from there, if I remember correctly. The United States, for whatever it may have done wrong in the Philippines, it did pretty good in building certain institutions. And they invested in healthcare specifically, not only hospitals, but also educational institutions to teach nurses and doctors and whatnot. And so the Philippines, as a result, produces a surprisingly large number of nurses every year. And a lot of them come over to the United States, where there's a lot of demand, obviously, for nurses. So they actually play a pretty important role. That is to say, the Philippines plays an important role in helping the United States with its healthcare industry by supplying a pretty steady stream of new nurses who can come here and work, often for pretty cheap and for pretty stringent hours. One of the more esoteric colonial legacies, I guess you could say.
Chad is asking about the transition from Spanish rule in the Philippines to America, quote, liberating them so they could have a coaling station to China.
Yeah, that was part of it. You know, the fact that, well, Manila never stopped being important to trade in Asia, specifically trade between China and the rest of the world. You know, the Spanish themselves were very attracted to Manila and acquired it pretty much so that they could take advantage of the China trade. And a good chunk of the galleon trade in the Pacific was between Manila and Mexico. So for the United States, there was a similar attraction. I think by the what Spanish-American War would have been 1890s, I think. So by then, Manila had kind of declined in importance. You know, the China trade itself had declined in importance. You know, I think what were the major trade items between the West and China? I think they were tea, porcelain, uh, silk. I think those were the three main ones. And then, of course, the British bought it with drugs. That's a whole other conversation. But by that point, the British had started growing a lot of tea in India, specifically in northeastern India. And other places had kind of figured out how to make their own silk as well. And British industry had started mass producing porcelain goods. So, all told, some of the major trade items that had been driving trade between China and the West were becoming less valuable because they were being produced in other places. And so that kind of devalued China trade to a degree. But at the same time, China was such a large market that the prospect of selling goods to hundreds of millions of people and the corresponding profit kind of drove a lot of countries, including the US government, to try to expand their access to Chinese markets. And for the United States, during its imperialist phase, uh, the Philippines was an attractive acquisition in order to facilitate and defend U.S. access to Chinese markets. So it wasn't just about access to the Philippines market and controlling that territory. It was also about using it as a jumping off point to project force in East Asia in order to defend U.S. trade in the region.
Hmm.
How useful it was is kind of debatable. I mean, really, I think the United States was kind of more dependent on the Royal Navy than the U.S. Navy for a lot of the 19th century to defend its trade. But it's the thought that counts, I'd say.
Royal
It was
Navy
definitely,
being the British Navy.
yeah, the British Navy. I was reading actually a book that I got recently by Corey Shaki about the transition of power between British hegemony in the world and American hegemony. And that period there in the late 19th century, early 20th century was particularly important to that transition because that was the period when the United States was just starting to ascend past the United Kingdom to the point whereby I think World War one of our arguments was that by World War One, the United States had basically already surpassed the British in terms of just raw power, you know, economic influence and political influence and whatnot. We just didn't have the empire, you know, so to speak. And so there was this sort of weird give and take between the British trying to defend their empire by managing their relations with the United States, which was actually the most important relationship that they had as far as defending their empire, because the United States was in a position to basically strip it from them if we'd really wanted to. And then the United States, for its part, basically used its power over Britain in order as leveraged its power over Britain in order to get various concessions. And I haven't read the whole book yet. I'm kind of just starting, but sort of the crux of the introduction, which reviews some of the ideas, is that the transition between British and American hegemony is one of, if not the only, peaceful such transition in history. And it had to do with a lot of the unique similarities that existed between the British and the Americans, just as a people and culturally and whatnot. But before I get too much further into this tangent, um, the United States didn't really need the Philippines. There was a huge debate about it in the United States about whether or not it was a good idea to take it, and after we'd taken it during the Spanish-American War, whether or not we should keep it. And one of the articles I actually read recently about this, actually this exact question, was that President McKinley was actually opposed to acquiring the Philippines before the war, but that over the course of the war, after we'd acquired it and won it in battle, basically, he was suddenly much more averse to letting it go, and that was just because he saw it as such a unique opportunity that he was sort of biased against just letting it go for nothing. And so, just because of that innate bias against, losing something that you already have, basically, for that reason, he may have changed his mind. And so the United States ended up keeping the Philippines, not necessarily for the strategic or economic reasons, but maybe just because, to a degree, at least in part, because President McKinley just felt that he couldn't let it go for nothing. I think that was an article that I posted on my Twitter feed. I can't remember who exactly wrote it, but it was an interesting look at some of the psychology of leadership and how leaders are as subject to the same kinds of cognitive biases that, regular people are. Like in general, people will be more concerned about losing something they already have than potentially gaining something of greater value.
Loss aversion.
Yeah. So that's just an innate bias in people, and so McKinley may have been subject to that. So this author that I read was positing, and that may be why he changed his mind about keeping the Philippines and why in turn the Philippines ended up being an American territory for so long. But yeah, the original the original question before I got off on that, the transition between Spanish and American rule. Yeah, so the United States, um, you know, whatever the argumentation about the reasoning and impetus behind acquiring the territory was, the United States ended up with it. And so one of the things the United States did early on is to kind of disempower the friars. Because at this point in history, the United States was still fairly biased against Catholics. Um, I guess this is going to be another tangent, but one of the ways that European powers, and the United States for that matter, justified imperialism was by arguing that we were bringing civilization to benighted, ignorant, backwards peoples.
The word of God.
The word of God. But in the Philippines, that logic didn't really quite work because they were already Catholic.
Sorry, we already have God.
Yeah, yeah. The Spanish had already converted like most of the population, and the principal point of criticism there, though, as a result, was not really about civilization per se. It was more about development. We're not going to civilize the people. We're going to develop and uplift them. And so there was talk about, investment, infrastructure spending, building institutions, stuff like that. And, to refer back to what I mentioned before, the United States was still very biased against Catholics at that time. While Spanish rule was seen as, better than, say, pagan rule, it wasn't seen as much better. The Spanish were seen to have mismanaged the Philippines and to have not really done much to really uplift the people. And one of the principal points of criticism was that friars and representatives of the Catholic Church, perhaps in general, were given much too much power in the Philippines. The church owned lots of land, and local friars had lots of political and social power within their local communities, which was sometimes abused. And the Spanish, when they were there, of course, were happy to maintain that system and protect it. But when the United States came in, we basically just dismantled it. The Catholic Church, was still powerful afterwards. It's still powerful today, but the institutional mechanisms by which that power is exercised are no longer nearly as strong as they were under Spanish rule. So that was one of the big changes. One of the interesting things the United States did in the Philippines in the early days is that it actually limited corporate investment in the Philippines. And I thought that was pretty interesting because this was sort of the Gilded Age when this is happening, an era of great inequality and corporate power. And one of the big topics in American politics at that time was what to do about that. What kind of trust busting policies should we be implementing? That was what they called it back then. And one of the manifestations of that, beyond opposition to acquiring the Philippines in the first place, was opposition to allowing U.S. corporations free reign in the Philippines. And the concern at the time, from what I remember reading, was that the U.S. corporations would just buy all the land in the country and would impoverish broad swaths of the rural population. So there was concern about that to the point where they actually passed a rule which limited corporate investment in the Philippines, specifically to prevent that from happening. So on the one hand, that prevented that eventuality from happening. The Philippines did not end up being just an exclusively all corporate owned entity, basically. But it also meant that there was not as much economic dynamism in the economy in the sense that a lot of the established landed elite in the country maintain their hold on the country. The Philippines, even today, is disproportionately dominated by the old landed elite, the sort of economic elites who own most of the territory in the country. And, maybe if corporations had been allowed to buy more of the land, they would have been uprooted and those elites would have been disempowered to some degree. But as was, they were able to maintain their hold on the country. So, you know, the devil you know or the devil you don't, basically. The landed elite or U.S. corporations, maybe not much of an improvement either way. But as a result of that specific policy decision, the landed elite were somewhat protected as a result and were able to survive the 20th century, which saw a lot of other landed elites and around the world and also in Southeast Asia in particular, sort of targeted explicitly either by land reform policies, by reformist governments, or by revolutionary radicals who specifically targeted landed elites as class enemies, often violently. So that's one of the reasons that the Filipino political economy looks the way it does today. Or at least it's one of the contributing factors. Again, there's probably more to it. I need to read more Filipino history in order to kind of really know it in depth, but I did read at least that much anyway.
People were asking, what was the name of the book that you mentioned that you're reading?
Oh, I think I've got it over here. Yeah, here we go. Safe Passage by Corey Shaki.
Thank you.
It's actually been on my reading list for a while. I finally just paid for the hard copy, or the hardcover, rather. I was reading through that while I was at the DMV a couple weeks ago.
It's a good opportunity to kill some time. It's a very boring place. No one wants to be there.
It is at that. Yeah, Texas is doing a little better in that regard. Apparently, I haven't had to renew my driver's license in person in like more than a decade or something like that. So I wasn't familiar with how the process was now.
Mm-hmm.
But apparently they've got these new mega centers, these big, large government facilities where they'll process like a lot of people at the same time.
Mm-hmm.
So it didn't take as long as I was expecting. It didn't take 10 minutes like some of the stuff online was suggesting it might, but yeah, I think it was like maybe an hour, probably not even that. So pretty relatively efficient. I have to give them credit.
Nice.
You do have to make an appointment, though. I was unaware of that.
Oh.
My driver's license ended up expiring because I kept assuming, okay, I'll just go there, wait in line, and then do it. And I was gonna do that, and then when I was reading about it the day of, basically, I found out, oh, you have to file an appointment beforehand. And the earliest I could get was like the following week, so I couldn't drive for a little while as a result. Lesson learned. Well, was there anything you kind of wanted to get to in particular here?
We didn't really cover Ukraine a ton last time, I don't think. Maybe that was when we reviewed some of the recent battles.
Well, I definitely have been keeping up the notes on that, so I'd be more than happy to address it.
Well, sure.
I guess in general, the pacing of the news coming out of Ukraine has slowed. So there's not as much new developments coming like there were in like the first month or two. But in general, the war is going relatively well for Ukraine. Has been since the last time we talked anyway. I think it was, 2 weeks since we last talked. So I think some of the big recent news is that Ukraine may have outright won the Battle of Kharkiv, which is pretty cool. Uh, the Russians had been trying to apply some pressure there as part of their, offensive in and around Donbass, but recently they've been losing territory basically. There was a Ukrainian counteroffensive, and they've been pushing the Russians back. And it was forcing the Russians to make some hard decisions about how to distribute their forces. Because the main thrust of their offensive right now in eastern Ukraine is still in Donbass. But because the Ukrainians were putting pressure on them in and around Kharkiv, there was some talk that they were having to redistribute some units away from the Donbass offensive towards Kharkiv in order to try to counter them. But I'm not sure what came of that because the most recent news is that they've basically been pushed back to the border in a lot of places around Kharkiv, and that the Russians are no longer in artillery range. I think I also read that recently, which means that the city can't be shelled anymore. They'll probably still hit it with missiles and stuff, but at least the Grad rocket launchers and the regular artillery should be out of range by this point, which I'm sure will be a relief for the people of the city. So some good news there. Let's see. As far as the Donbass offensive itself, there's been a lot of hard fighting there. I've heard it described as basically being World War II style fighting with trenches and front lines and whatnot. The whole shebang basically.
Hmm.
Pretty grueling stuff. One of the things I read, I think last week, which kind of, I guess I should have known. It shouldn't surprise me, but I just kind of, it slipped my mind, I guess. But there's a major river, or at least a relatively major river, that runs through Donbass called the Donetsk River. And that's turned into a major crux of the fighting. The Ukrainians are basically trying to defend the western side of the river and trying to prevent the Russians from crossing. And there's been a fair amount of fighting just from the Russians trying to cross the river, largely unsuccessfully thus far. I think the past couple days in particular, there was some video and pictures and whatnot of failed Russian crossing attempts to get across the river. Crossing rivers is very difficult in warfare. It's kind of a specialty. If you can get around it, that's pretty much ideal. If you, well, when I say get around it, I mean if you can avoid having to do it. It's better to try to circumvent it or maybe use paratroopers or something like that. But attacking a defended position on the other side of a river is sometimes unavoidable, and so the Russians are kind of learning the hard way how problematic that is. Let's see. I think there was also some fighting again around Easium. But I also read at a Pentagon briefing. Well, I read I read a Pentagon briefing. There we go. That the Russian offensive in Donbass takes territory, but that a lot of the time the Russians will just retreat immediately after, so they'll lose the territory very quickly. I'm not sure really what that signals. That could just be bad leadership, or I don't know. The Russians have had lots of problems with leadership and logistics and all manner of things. So maybe this is just another manifestation. But at the same time, I've also read that the Russians have been taking ground and keeping it. I know that recently the Ukrainians were pushed out of the town of Rubizhnya, which was one of the big focal points of the battle in Donbass. And at the same, also another update, the Ukrainians launched an offensive near Easium, a counteroffensive, I should say. So they're applying pressure there. So Rubizhnya, Easium, and I believe Lysychansk is also another major focal point of fighting right now. I read today that the principal objective of the Russians in the Donbass is still to encircle the bulk of Ukrainian forces in Donbass. So they want to try to encircle Severodonetsk and Lysychansk. So those two cities are what they're kind of looking to cut off from the rest of Ukraine here. But thus far, it's just been very slow progress. Partly that's an improvement. The Russians had kind of bled themselves white early in the war, trying to do a blitzkrieg that they just didn't have the capacity to do for a number of reasons. So the fact that they're being more deliberative and using tactics and approaches to combat that are more in keeping with their doctrine suggests that they're being at least a little smarter. this time, but they're still having lots of problems. There's still reports of high casualties. The aforementioned issue with taking ground and then immediately withdrawing from it, that's a problem. There's still lots of reports of desertions and low morale amongst Russian forces. So there's still a lot of issues there. And the Ukrainians, for their part, are probably taking more casualties than the Ukrainian government is letting on. Again, the fighting is pretty grueling. But at the same time, all of the reports suggest that they're very professional, competent, that they're taking advantage of Russian weaknesses, and that by and large, even when they lose territory, they're exacting a pretty heavy toll on the attackers. So overall, even if they're losing territory, they seem to be winning the overall battle thus far.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not clear to me that, in other words, that the Russians will be able to actually achieve their objective of surrounding Ukrainian forces in Donetsk and cutting them off. That seems unlikely given how they performed thus far. I would add here that the sources for this are largely Institute for the Study of War. They do like a daily briefing as far as what's happening in the war. So, in so much as that's a reliable source, you can trust what we're talking about here.
Did you see the fuss about Macron's comment that he should cede some territory so Putin can save face?
Yeah, I saw that. That wasn't great. It's not really the messaging, but that kind of, well, for one, Macron walked those comments back. He said he did not apply pressure to Zelensky to do that. He said he was just talking to Putin, basically, or something like that. But I don't think much will come of it either. I think that's just, the Ukrainians basically have a veto here.
Mm-hmm.
Even if the West isn't interested in a prolonged conflict and wants a negotiated settlement, Ukraine can just say that they don't want to do that and just not do that.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of ends the conversation right there. Hypothetically, the West could condition further support on Ukraine, adhering to Western preferences on a negotiated outcome, even perhaps one that involves conceding territory. But that would probably be very politically unpopular in most Western countries. So I don't really think that's a credible threat. So I think Ukraine is going to kind of get their way here. I suspect that they'll be able to continue fighting and to have relatively maximal goals as far as what kind of peace agreement that they're going to try to aim for, while at the same time continuing to enjoy Western support.
And the overall shift would be there was this invasion of Ukraine in the full scale kind of conflict, but before that in 2014 there was the Crimea push, and
Yeah,
Russia has held that, but it was never really officially recognized by the world at large that that's Russia.
correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, it was never officially recognized, and negotiation over the final status of Crimea has been a part of the on again, off again peace talks that have happened over the course of the past 8 years between Ukraine, Russia, and some of the other players in the Minsk Accords.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing's really come of it. It's worth pointing out that President Zelensky did say implicitly that Crimea would probably not be a part of any peace deal ending the current fighting. So he suggested then that that would not have to be a part of any kind of, that would not be a precondition, rather, to peace between Ukraine and Russia. So that suggests to me that even if the status of Crimea will remain unresolved after a peace agreement, it's not going to hold up a peace agreement either. It looks like they're going to focus more on eastern Ukraine and the status of Donetsk and Luhansk. So I suspect those will be some of the main sticking points in peace negotiations as they happen. Have you been keeping track of Mariupol at all?
I watched a documentary of it, but not like in the past few days. I know that it's been very heavily hit and it's not in good shape as a city. I think there's still that steel plant area.
Yeah, that's where most of the fighting is now.
Mm-hmm.
That's where the last defenders of the city are located. There's been, besides ongoing fighting, as the Russians attempt to storm the steelworks and eradicate the final vestiges of Ukrainian resistance there. Other than that, the other news out of the steelworks has been attempts to get civilians out, because there's actually a number of civilians who were hiding in the steelworks with the soldiers, trying to avoid contact with the Russian army for obvious reasons. You know, the Russian army at this point doesn't have a great track record with dealing with Ukrainian civilians. So there's been intermittent attempts, some of them even successful, to open humanitarian corridors to allow some of the Ukrainian civilians hiding in the steelworks to escape and relocate elsewhere. I think they've gotten most of them out at this point. See, from what I was reading, there's about 2,000 defenders left at the steelworks, although that's an old node. It's probably less by now. And there was some criticism, actually, from the soldiers there. Some of the soldiers there released a video criticizing President Zelensky for quote unquote failing to defend Mariupol. But even so, even as they're critical of the government, they say that they're not going to surrender. So it looks like they're going to fight to the end here.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty ballsy. You got to admire their courage.
For sure. And that steel plant must be a really defensible location.
Oh, it's huge. It's not just like a single factory. It's like a whole complex that's the size of a small city, and it has a whole bunch of tunnels underneath it too. So there's lots of space that you can hide in from shelling. You know, that's probably where the civilians have largely been. So that makes it really difficult for an attacker to try to uproot the defenders. They have lots of places to hide and stage ambushes and whatnot. Yeah, very, very defensible.
Yeah, we kind of call that like a campus or something, where a company controls it and they've got the factories that do stuff, and then you've got offices, and they've got apparently an underground here too. And that's the only part of the city that they still have?
I believe so, yeah. I think everything else has fallen by this point. There was some talk that the Russians may stage a Victory Day parade in Mariupol as part of their May 9th celebration. They have their, what is it, their Army Day or whatever it is, their celebration of the Army and particularly victory in World War II. So there was a big celebration in Russia over that and whatnot. But there was some speculation they may try to hold a parade in Mariupol. But they ended up not doing it just because it was considered unsafe, you know, for obvious reasons. So to the credit of the defenders in Mariupol, they were able to ruin that at least.
That would look just straight up apocalyptic, though, right? It's not like you're being showered with flower petals and the people are cheering. It's like a city that's been completely reduced to dust.
Well, it's the symbolism, you know, it's the symbolism of having a parade in a conquered city.
Yikers, Batman.
Yeah. Yeah, there was a lot of speculation that Vladimir Putin may take the opportunity during the Victory Day celebration to announce that there was going to be a general mobilization, and that the special military operation was actually a war, and that he was basically just going to crack down on even further on dissent, you know, basically just fully mobilize Russian society. And that didn't happen. So that was kind of one of the key things people have been watching for, and it didn't pan out. I think he just gave some generic comments about, you know, victory and war and, you know, some other nonsense. So it seems that the government is still going to try to fight what is a very difficult and expensive war, while trying to maintain the fiction amongst the civilian population in Russia that it's not actually a war. So that seems like a pretty big handicap, in my opinion. You know, given how tough the fighting has been, it seems like they're going to have to change that sooner or later. But for now, it's certainly to the benefit of the Ukrainians. You know, if the Russians are basically fighting with one hand tied behind their back, that's all the better for Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Russian government has done many inexplicable things since February of this year. So that's just another one. There's been more sabotage in Russia as well. There was a gunpowder factory in the city of Perm that burned. Saboteurs blew up a railroad bridge near Kursk. There was a fire at a military base near Belgorod. And, oh, I had that one twice. There's also been intermittent other fires that have been reported, but it's not clear how many of them are sabotage as opposed to just accidents. You know, keep in mind that Russian manufacturing is having to ramp up production in order to meet the needs of the Russian army, in so much as they can, given sanctions anyway. So that could partly explain a greater incidence of accidents and fires and whatnot. But from what I've been reading, the suspicion is that a lot of these are people upset at the government and who are trying to inhibit the Russian government from prosecuting the war in Ukraine. Let's see, and we did have a new study that was done trying to gauge Russian support for the war. So this one was more nuanced. In general, at the beginning of the war, people were saying that the Russian people didn't want the war and that they must be universally opposed and they just can't say they can't. And then opinion kind of shifted because there was more surveys done and there was a sense that actually a lot of people in Russia do support the war, that they're nationalists, that they don't want Ukraine to join NATO, and that there's other factors involved as well. But in general, people supported the government. And also there was an ostensible rally around the flag effect, even amongst people who didn't really have strong opinions about the war generally, but wanted to support the government. So now there's this new survey which kind of adds more nuance here. Basically, it suggests that while a lot of people in Russia, if not most people in Russia, support the war, their support is a little bit hollow. So basically, half of the people who participated in the survey said that they supported Putin's quote unquote special operation. But the survey designers noted, based off of the answers to their questionnaire, that the emotions that people reported feeling were kind of shallow. It was more hope and pride,
Mm-hmm.
more than anything, as opposed to like sort of a gung-ho nationalistic, go get 'em attitude. It was just more they're hoping that things pan out, and they have pride in their country, like they usually do. But hope is kind of an unexpected answer. That wasn't really what the survey designers were expecting.
Mm-hmm.
They also reported 20% of the survey participants reported opposing the war, and they generally felt, shame, guilt, anger, outrage, and pretty much what you would expect. And there was also 25% who said they didn't have a strong opinion. Well, either they had no strong opinion or they supported the war but with reservations. As far as how they reported feeling, they said that they reported sadness. So all told, that's about what 75% here. So the half that supported the operation and the one quarter that didn't have a strong opinion or supported with reservations. That's 75% that are not really fully invested in the conflict. According to, the emotions that people reported feeling, it seems that they're not really fully invested in the conflict and that they're just sort of hoping for the best rather than feeling that Russia itself is under threat and that they need to make big sacrifices in order to win at all costs.
Did they talk at all about how the information flow isn't really an even exchange of like you can express pro-war or anti-war sentiments on media and news? Like you get slapped if you say anything anti-war.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it wasn't mentioned. It wasn't mentioned in the survey specifically, but it's kind of implicitly assumed, basically, that that is going to have an effect on the outcome. It's just not clear how great the effect is or how to adjust for it.
mm-hmm.
So studies like this, you have to kind of keep that in mind. There's going to be issues with reporting, issues with people not being completely honest with their answers, etc. Those are issues with all surveys, but especially surveys in authoritarian political systems. But even so, uh, you can compare this survey with some of the other surveys and make, useful inferences. Rather, you can draw useful conclusions and make useful inferences just by comparing, the outcomes, comparing the data. So the surveys that say that most people support the conflict, those are as subject to the bias as subject to bias as this survey that I'm talking about. So the differences between the surveys still suggest that even if people support the war, it's kind of a qualified hollow support.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to always control for bias if you're able to kind of compare across surveys where that bias is constant. That was one of the things I remember from grad school. It was a little counterintuitive, but basically you don't have to control for variables that are constant across surveys, basically. I don't remember it. I'm not explaining it well, but that's the gist of it.
Are you saying that every news source has a bias and people should be mindful of that bias when they're browsing the news source?
Yeah, well, that kind of goes without saying too. Yeah, that is an important factor.
I think it's worth saying.
Yeah, it definitely is worth saying. I'm just getting tripped up on this variable thing.
Yeah.
It's one of those things you think you know until you try to explain it, and then you trip over it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, normally you have to control for all of the variables when you want to build a model.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and if you want to compare populations in particular. But if there's some variable you can't control, but which is constant, you can just leave it in. And you can still make inferences on the other variables because it's assumed that whatever effect that constant variable is having on your population, well, more accurately, your sample, it's going to have an equal effect regardless of circumstances across the population. So you can just leave that in without controlling for it and then still figure out whether or not other variables are statistically significant. That's probably the best explanation I can do without brushing up on it. So I'll leave it at that before I get it even more confusing. But let's see. We talked about that. There was a new aid package passed in the United States, so another, what was it, 30 billion, I think, that was allocated. So that's another strong signal that the United States is going to stay committed, at least for the short to medium term. I also thought this was an interesting note. There was a report in Meduza, which is a Russian opposition outlet. They're continuing to operate, but they had to relocate out of Russia. That was the only way they could make it work. But they were reporting that Baltic intelligence agencies, that is to say the intelligence agencies of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, are playing an important role as far as intelligence sharing with Ukraine. Obviously, the United States and the UK and some of the other big intelligence powers in Europe are also playing an important role. But I just thought it was interesting that the Baltic states, even though they have much fewer resources and smaller intelligence agencies, they've been providing a lot of support in the form of communications intercepts. So that's sort of their little niche area there that they've been helping with. Kind of makes sense. There's a lot of Russian speakers in those territories, so they're kind of uniquely qualified to do that. But I just thought it was kind of a pretty cool bit of trivia there. That was one of the ways that the Baltic states are making a unique contribution.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. And then I think this was I read another article by Meduza in which they were talking about how people in Russia perceive the war, and they kind of did a deep dive. They didn't use data or surveys or anything. They just tried to talk to a lot of people and gather firsthand accounts from conversations with relatives and whatnot. And one of the things that they noted, which they thought was counterintuitive, was that people in the rural areas report supporting the war, supporting the government. Again, that's the kind of rally around the flag effect. But as far as people who were like ideologically committed to the war and who supported, full stock the government's narrative about the war, they said that those people tended to be more in Moscow, which isn't really what I would have expected, but maybe it kind of makes sense since ideology is kind of something that increases more with education, and Moscow and St. Petersburg obviously are the most economically developed and have the best education in Russia. So maybe that accounts for it, but some interesting trivia there as well. It seems most of Russia's ideologues are disproportionately centered in Moscow, if not also St. Petersburg.
I think some of that is just people assessing what does the government do for me, and the further you are from the best places to live in Russia, the less the government is doing for you, at least how it feels.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that would make sense.
Yeah, self-interest.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Well, other than that, I think the other notes I had were diplomacy. There's been a lot of action here as far as diplomacy, not all of it directly to do with Ukraine. Some of it has to do with Scandinavia. So the Swedish government was saying that they're going to decide on NATO membership by May 15th today. So presumably that's going to be decided. I haven't read any headlines to that effect yet. But we'll probably have a final, well, a near final decision anyway, pretty soon on that. There was some drama with Finland. The Russian government has been basically just issuing casual death threats over the prospect of Finland and Sweden joining NATO, but they haven't really been following through much. But they did announce that they were going to cut off Finland from electricity sold from Russia to Finland. But this was a mostly empty threat because most of Finland's electricity comes from other sources. From what I read, they got something like 15% of their electricity from Russian sellers. So not that much. So they were able to make up for it largely by increasing production of electricity within Finland and importing some from outside Finland, from other non-Russian sources. So more Russian token efforts to resist this accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO. I think the bigger drama was Turkey, because the Turkish government and the president Recep Erdogan in particular came out and said that he was quote unquote not positive about the accession of Finland and Sweden to NATO. And he specifically said that he had concerns about Sweden and Finland supposedly harboring Kurdish militants. So if
What?
you're not familiar, yeah. Well, Turkey, of course, has longstanding issues with its Kurdish population, and in particular, the radical nationalist group called the PKK, which is both a Kurdish nationalist group as well as a sort of militant communist group. It's kind of a weird ideology they have, but that's the gist of it. And they've been fighting against the Turkish government for greater autonomy for the Kurdish population of Turkey for several decades now. And so there's been long-standing criticism of Turkish treatment of its Kurdish minority, especially in areas where there's resistance to Turkish rule. And that's resulted in some tension between Turkey and other governments in Europe, because some of those governments not only criticize Turkey for human rights abuses in Turkey, but also they allow some people asylum from those Kurdish territories. And some of those people have ties to the PKK or other militant groups. So the issue for Turkey, of course, is that they want some concessions on that. They want greater recognition of the threat posed by the PKK, among other perhaps militant Kurdish groups, and greater cooperation from Sweden and Finland as far as at least not allowing them, safe haven there, if not outright cooperation with helping the Turkish government track them down and maybe even extradite them.
Oh, is that what they did then? They allowed PKK people safe haven in those countries?
I don't know specifically if they allow them safe haven. I think it's more asylum. And I don't even know if there's that many actual PKK members. I haven't read enough into it.
Mm-hmm.
But the Turkish government, for its part, that's why they're making a big deal out of it. They haven't said that they're going to condition Turkish acceptance of Finland and Sweden into NATO on any kind of action on this issue. He just said that he's not positive. So that basically means he wants some kind of concession. I think if it were like a big deal for Turkey, if they wanted to really draw a line in the sand and basically demand that Sweden and Finland change their policy towards Kurdish asylum, then he would have been much more explicit, as far as resisting NATO accession.
Mm.
So as is, he's basically just saying, yeah, well, maybe I'll veto it, maybe not, which means that he wants to get paid off. And given Turkey's economy, if you've been keeping track of that, it's not that much of a surprise that he wants some kind of reward there. I suspect it might be something like recognition of Turkish claims to natural gas deposits in the Eastern Mediterranean. That's been a big sort of diplomatic sore point for the past some years. The Turkish government really wants to exploit those resources in order to try to float government finances, but also to try to juice the Turkish economy, which continues to struggle, mostly because of economic mismanagement by the Turkish government, which, for reasons unknown, if you at least unknown if you don't want to take the Turkish government at its word, the Turkish government refuses to raise interest rates as a response to inflation. And if you're familiar with economics, then one of the main policy tools you have to fight inflation is higher interest rates. So as a result, inflation has basically just been getting worse and worse in Turkey,
Mm.
and the Turkish economy has been suffering as a result.
Yeah, there's a movie Revolver, and there's the main villain guy. He talks about one of the ways that he got rich, and he was saying that for anything that is asked of him, the first question is always, "What's in it for me?" And for this case of should Sweden and Finland join NATO, he's a leader that has some power and he has some say in NATO, and he can respond to that instead of saying, "Are Sweden and Finland a good fit for NATO?" He could say, "What's in it for me? What's in it for this country here?" as opposed to theirs. Chad is also pointing out that just generally, not really asylum specifically, but Sweden recognizes the killing of Kurds as genocide. So Turkey
Really?
disliked that. Yeah.
Well, I hadn't read that. Yeah, I could see how that would aggravate some of the Turkish nationalists.
Yeah.
That's certainly going to be a sore point for them.
Yeah. For the U.S., I think the Kurds are seen as like freedom fighters. So we've talked about Kurdish fighters in the past and how they've been basically kind of squished into a pretty rough territory in the mountains, and they have to fight lots of people pretty often. So I think we feel more admiration for their courage rather than anything else, but it's the opposite side of the world. So most people don't really know too much about it in the U.S., probably even in Sweden or Finland either. But yeah, he could make it a sticking point issue if he wants to. There was a question about the thoughts on the upcoming Libyan elections. Is a fair election even possible? And with candidates such as Gaddafi's son and Khalifa Haftar, who are openly against democracy, will either accept the results, or is Libya doomed for a continued civil war?
I thought they already had those elections. Maybe I'm wrong. I haven't been following it closely. I read about it intermittently. But the last thing I remember is that they were going to hold an election, they held it, and then there was a refusal to recognize the results by, I think, the Tripoli government this time. And so that resulted in basically prolonged negotiations about how to resolve the issue. And in effect, the election has been annulled. In fact, it hasn't had any kind of impact. So I guess they may have organized another one, but I doubt they're going to be able to make it work any better.
Mm-hmm.
Fundamentally, there's just a big divide between Haftar over in the eastern part of Libya, in Benghazi, and then the Tripoli government over in the west, which is more sort of dominated by militia groups that had fought against Gaddafi during the civil war. So they've just never been able to agree on anything, not least because Haftar himself is kind of seen as a proxy for Egypt and Saudi Arabia. He's seen as a strongman leader who wants to dominate the country. So people in the west of the country think that, he's just going to discard democratic institutions once he's in power. So there's a big lack of trust there. But then to be fair to the Eastern government, the Tripoli government has actually been more responsible for scuppering a lot of the attempts at building institutions in Libya. Generally, I think it was actually them who were the first to refuse to recognize a democratic election result. This would have been like way back the first election after the war ended rather. The Tripoli government basically just refused to recognize that it had lost seats and that the Benghazi sort of faction had gained seats, and the result was a collapse, a de facto bifurcation of the country between the Tripoli and Benghazi governments. And that's pretty much where they've been for the past 10 years. There have been consistent efforts to try to negotiate and mediate between the two sides and build some kind of common government that everybody respects, but nothing's ever come of it. So I guess to answer the question, probably, yeah, prolonged civil war seems to be in the cards. I don't think the war is as bad as it was before, though. I think Haftar had launched a big offensive, what was it, a couple years ago, I guess. 2020, I guess, maybe 2019. And it was looking like he might take the capital and just totally extinguish the Tripoli government. But then the Turks came in with their now famous Bayraktar drones and defeated that offensive, as a result of which the status quo has persisted. So it doesn't look like there's going to be a military solution to the conflict, but neither does it appear that there's going to be really any kind of solution. It looks like they're just sort of stuck. So it's more like very warm frozen conflict at this point. It's not quite fully frozen yet, but it's getting there.
It's an icy hot conflict.
Yeah. Yeah, the Saudis don't like the Tripoli government because they've got some people with ties to the Muslim Brotherhood there.
Mm-hmm.
And pretty much all of the Gulf monarchy governments hate the Muslim Brotherhood. Not just because of alleged ties to terrorism, but also because the Brotherhood is seen as a threat to the continuity of monarchical rule in the region. They see the Brotherhood as being a revolutionary force that would overthrow their governments and replace them with Islamic republics, perhaps in the Iranian style.
Mm.
So whenever there's a Muslim Brotherhood affiliated group that comes anywhere near power, all of the Gulf monarchies flip out and they generally side with whoever is opposing that Muslim Brotherhood affiliated faction. So in the case of Libya, that means propping up Haftar in the east of Libya. So he gets a lot of support from the Emiratis, from the Saudis, as well as from the Egyptians. Egypt isn't a Gulf monarchy, but uh, they've got a pan-Arab nationalist government, but they're just as opposed to Muslim Brotherhood rule, and they crack down on them just as much, if not more.
Mm-hmm. What are the other Gulf monarchies aside from Saudi Arabia?
The list is Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, uh, Bahrain, technically Oman, but Oman is generally neutral. They kind of try to do their own thing. They kind of maintain diplomatic distance from Saudi Arabia. Bahrain is basically well within Saudi Arabia's sphere of influence. They kind of can't really do anything without Saudi permission. There's some big protests in Bahrain during the Arab Spring, for example, and Saudi troops were actually dispatched to Bahrain to help put it down. So the Saudis have a lot of influence there. Uh, Qatar, or Qatar, depending on how you want to pronounce it, is also a Gulf monarchy, but they also maintain their own sort of independence, foreign policy wise. There's actually a long-running feud between the royal families of Qatar and Saudi Arabia. There was an attempt in the 90s by the Saudis apparently to overthrow the Qatari royal family. And the Qataris, for their part, are go out of their way to how to fund and maintain Al Jazeera. The Arab language version of Al Jazeera is very, very anti-Gulf. They're very anti-monarchy, and
Mm.
they tend to give voice to radicals and various other Islamists. Not like violent jihadists, but just sort of political Islamists, people who want
People who believe
Islamic,
that the religion should have a lot of power in government.
yeah, that, and that they want more representative government and reforms, if not an outright end to monarchy in the region.
Mm.
So the fact that the Qatari government funds that and allows those messages to kind of proliferate through the region on their media is a major sore point between the Qatari government and the Saudi government. The Saudis really, really hate that.
Mm-hmm.
For those of you who maybe have been listening to the segment for a while, you may remember back during the Trump years, we talked about the feud between the Saudis and the Qataris and how the Saudis built a wall separating the Qatari territory, because the Qatar is basically a peninsula that connects to Saudi territory. The Saudis built a wall just totally separating Qatar from Saudi Arabia. And that was done as part of an embargo that the Saudis implemented to try to punish the Qataris and get them on side as far as their foreign policy. Didn't end up working, but that just illustrates how bad relations have been between them. But yeah, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, Oman, and maybe, well, Kuwait also, but maybe you could kind of throw in Jordan, kind of. It's not really a Gulf monarchy because it's not anywhere near the Gulf of the Persian Gulf, but it is a monarchy and it is sort of part of the alliance of kings, in the region.
Mm-hmm.
So they tend to work pretty closely with the Saudis. Although I think they work more closely with the United States and Britain, at least in the Jordanian case. Because the trouble the Jordanians have is that they don't have any oil. One of the defining characteristics of Gulf monarchies is that they have a shit ton of oil to sell. That's their main tool as far as their economy, but also in terms of their foreign policy. But Jordan doesn't really have any. Jordan pretty much just has refugees. That's their principal import. They have a whole bunch of Palestinian refugees living there and who have been living there for something like half a century now. I think people who are either Palestinian refugees or who are descended from Palestinian refugees comprise something like half of the population of Jordan. That just gives you an idea of just how many refugees have come there. They don't really give them full rights. I think there's still a lot of restrictions on what kinds of jobs they can work. So there's a lot of tension there between some of the refugees and the government. The government kind of tries to maintain the fiction that someday they'll all be able to go home to Palestine someday, even though that's probably not going to happen. In fact, almost certainly not going to happen. But because they have this big refugee problem, and refugees are expensive, especially if you're a poorer country, Jordan is very dependent on foreign aid from Western allies. And there's also kind of a soft connection, sort of soft influence. Uh, all of the royal family of Jordan, well, not all of them per se, but all of the men anyway, attend Sandhurst, I believe, which is like Britain's equivalent of West Point. It's like the big military academy that produces officers for the British military. They also take people from other countries. And a lot of the Middle Eastern monarchies actually send their children to study at Sandhurst. It's very common. So Jordan in particular, uh, has that as an important tie, between their country and the West, because there's a lot of personal connections that you develop while you study at Sandhurst. Like you do at any institution. You got to go to college, you meet people, you build a network. It's the same thing at a military academy or at a corporation or like at a job, same deal. So the King of Jordan has ties that stem from that, as well as the dependence on financial aid. I think that's all of them, if I'm not mistaken.
Nice. We have visited the Gulf monarchies, Russia, Ukraine, the Philippines, and more so far.
There's a little more on the diplomatic front here.
Hmm.
It's not really new information, but Russia's nominal allies, or at least countries that are usually more friendly towards Russia, kind of continue to refuse to help them in their war. So one note that I had here about Azerbaijan is that they had closed their airspace to Russian military aircraft. And as a result, Russian military aircraft carrying military cargo from Armenia to Russia have to fly over the Caspian Sea and Iran in order to make the trip. So that would be a pretty easy thing for Azerbaijan to do, that is to say, to allow them to use their airspace, but they kind of went out of their way to not do that. So I thought that was interesting, given that Azerbaijan normally has relatively good relations with Russia. Azerbaijan does have some leverage here because Russia actually imports a lot of natural gas and oil from Azerbaijan. A good chunk of the natural gas that Russia exports to Europe actually comes from Central Asia or the Caucasus. They actually consume most, if not all, of the natural gas that they produce in Russia, because a lot of Russian industry is still pretty old and inefficient. So Gazprom exports gas that they'll get from places like Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, or Azerbaijan, as the case may be. So those are important sources, and so that gives Azerbaijan, in this case, some leverage. They have enough leverage that Russia kind of refused to help Armenia during the Second Karabakh War that broke out back in 2020, or was it 2021? The years are starting to blend together. I'm getting old. Whenever the war was, anyway, Armenia has a treaty alliance with Russia in which both countries agree to defend each other if they come under attack. And Armenia came under attack, so they were, of course, asking Russia to come and assist them. But the Russian government didn't really want to aggravate Azerbaijan. They kind of saw Azerbaijan as the more important partner, even though they don't have any kind of treaty alliance with them. And so that kind of illustrates Azeri influence in the region. Even though they don't have formal ties with Russia, the economic importance of Azerbaijan means that Russia values the relationship. Now, to be fair to the Russians here, technically the Azeris attacked Karabakh, which was sort of a pseudo-independent separatist republic, rather than attacking Azerbaijan, rather than attacking Armenia itself. So that was the technicality that the Russians used to justify inaction on their part. But it was pretty widely perceived as a technicality, a fact which was not lost on people in Armenia. So Azerbaijan continues to benefit from that privileged position to the point where that they're able to kind of signal that they oppose the war here. And as far as why they would do that, I think it's just because they want to make sure that they don't spoil relations with the West. You know, the West is still applying sanctions to Russia and trying to isolate it. And so countries that have close ties to Russia are put in this awkward position where they can support Russia and reaffirm their relationship, but then probably alienate the West and potentially lose economic ties to the West, which would be, you know, very expensive in some cases. On the other hand, if you distance yourself from Russia, you can avoid potential sanctions or other forms of punishment from the West, but it probably is going to somewhat undermine the relationship with Russia in the long term. Thus far, most countries seem to be willing to risk alienating Russia. It seems that they value a relationship with the West more. Also, it could also be an attempt to signal to Russia that they oppose this kind of aggression, because a lot of countries around Russia have sizable ethnic Russian minorities. And so there's concern that Russia may use the presence of those minorities as a kind of casus belli, you know, as an attempt to try to, as an excuse basically to intervene and launch some kind of special military operation, as you might call it. So Kazakhstan in particular was upset about the 2014 conflict. You know, back then it was over Crimea and Luhansk and Donetsk. So you might have expected Kazakhstan being a, you know, pretty close country, being a country pretty close to Russia, that they would have supported Russia categorically, but as was, they actually voiced opposition because they didn't like the precedent that was being set. And they've actually done that again in this current conflict. So Azerbaijan may be sending a signal in that vein here as well. Also, I thought it was interesting that Serbian tabloids were pretty upset with Russia a couple weeks ago. Putin came out and stated that the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, the two separatist republics that Russia created in eastern Ukraine, Putin said that those republics have the right to decide on their own sovereignty without the permission of the central government, that is to say, Kiev. And more to the point, he said that they have the right to do that just like Kosovo. And that's a big trigger word for people in Serbia, especially Serbian nationalists. If you're not familiar with the whole Kosovo thing, Kosovo was a territory that was part of Serbia. It had a large, well, it was majority ethnic Albanian. And, you know, long story short, there was violence being committed against the minority. The minority itself was committing acts of violence in order to try to separate from Serbia. It was a bit of a mess, but the West intervened and basically broke Kosovo off from Serbia in order to, you know, protect the population from alleged genocide by the Serbian government. So obviously, Serbian nationalists really hated that, and they insist to this day that Kosovo is an integral part of Serbia. That's a major part of Serbian politics, even. Like, even if you're a reformer, you can't really just come out and say Kosovo is an independent country, we should just let it go. That's kind of borderline political suicide. So it's a very sensitive subject. And one of the reasons that Serbian nationalists really love Russia, besides just cultural affinity and historical ties and whatnot, there's also the fact that back in the 90s, the Russian government actually supported Serbia during the conflict over Kosovo. And so that created some pretty strong ties. But when Vladimir Putin came out and said that the separatist republics in Ukraine have just as much a right to declare independence as Kosovo, there was some hyperventilating in Serbian tabloids that the Russian government had stabbed them in the back. Because that line of argumentation implicitly argues that Kosovo's separation was legitimate, which of course Serbia doesn't, which of course Serbian nationalists don't believe. So I don't think this is going to undermine the Serbian-Russian relationship in the long term, but I did think it was interesting that the Russian government aggravated one of its few allies like this. It's part of just a kind of general trend of bad diplomacy on their part. And speaking of which, I hadn't come to the crowning achievement of dumb diplomacy on the part of the Russians over the past couple weeks, which was Israel. Did you follow this at all?
The journalist?
No, no. The comments made by Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia,
Oh no.
about Israel. Well, not about Israel, but rather about Zelensky. Specifically, he was talking about how the fact that Zelensky is Jewish doesn't mean that he's not a Nazi. And then he came out and said that Hitler had been part Jewish, which is extremely offensive to people in Israel. Because, of course, that line of argumentation has been used to suggest that actually the Holocaust wasn't that bad.
Ah.
Yeah. So everybody in Israel, all across the political spectrum, had a big tiff over that. And the Russian government was in the doghouse for a bit. The thing that I thought was especially stupid about that, though, is that after Sergei Lavrov made those comments, he was sort of challenged about them, asked about them, and he doubled down. He actually said, "No, it's true. Hitler was part Jewish, so Zelensky is a Nazi. Just like Hitler being part Jewish didn't mean he was any less of a Nazi." So that was a missed opportunity there to kind of repair the damage, and that just made things worse. So again, that's just another example of Russian diplomacy being incompetent here around the issue of Ukraine. And I kind of get the impression they don't really quite know what to do with themselves. How do you manage something this catastrophic as far as the damage done to ties to foreign countries? It seems that the best they can do is to just pump out misinformation as much as possible and with as much confidence as possible. Now, to be fair, Vladimir Putin here actually came out, I think, a week or so after the comments were made and apologized for Lavrov's comments. And that's a pretty big deal because you don't really hear Putin apologize for much. So that suggests that they were concerned about the damage to the relationship with Israel.
That could be a little good cop, bad cop routine as well.
A little bit there, a little bit, but I think that's giving them a lot of credit that I don't think their record over the past couple weeks suggests they deserve.
Yeah.
So that's why I'm a little skeptical on that going.
Yeah, more likely he's just saying shit.
Yeah, that's my impression anyway. But yeah, that was just a bad episode. I don't think it did too much damage. I mean, they did apologize for it eventually. And Israel, I don't recall, has really changed its position. Israel has been kind of on the fence about Ukraine. They haven't condemned the war, but they haven't either come out and said anything that would support the Russian position. They've just kind of been trying to remain neutral and focus on the Middle East, which is their principal area of concern, obviously. But the Israeli government did have to come out and at least pretend to be aggravated about it. I'm sure they actually were aggravated in this case, but probably fixable overall. In general, Israel and Russia want to avoid aggravating each other because both of them are sort of in the same neighborhood, not just in the Middle East, but, specifically in Syria. The Russian military still has troops deployed in Syria trying to back Bashar al-Assad in the civil war. And the Israelis, for their part, don't have troops in Syria, but they have been bombing Syria pretty regularly since the civil war started, but especially over the past 5 years in order to try to deter the Iranians from setting up any kind of strong presence there. So that obviously creates issues of confliction, right? What if there's an Israeli bombing raid that accidentally kills some Russians? That's going to be a problem diplomatically. And then, of course, vice versa is true as well. What if some Russian surface-to-air missile systems shoot down an Israeli aircraft? That's also a problem. So they try to maintain cordial ties just to try to maintain deconfliction mechanisms in Syria. Because as is, one or the other party could just abandon those deconfliction mechanisms, and then there's a much higher risk of escalation in the region. And Russia, for its part, is particularly eager, I imagine, to avoid escalation in Syria right now, given that they really don't have much to spare as far as forces that might be able to go to Syria and help out the Assad government. And the Israelis, for their part, don't want to aggravate the Russians because they don't want the Russians to double down and send more support to, say, the Iranians or to Palestinians, like in the West Bank. What were they called? Hamas, for example. There's lots of little asymmetrical ways Russia could retaliate to something like that, and I'm sure the Israelis would rather avoid it. So there's this weird diplomatic dance between the two over Ukraine that's been happening as a result. Let's see, there's been some stuff about I was reading more about the occupation of Ukraine. That's another thing I've been keeping my eye on. There's been more chatter about a potential referendum, specifically in Kherson Oblast in the south of Ukraine, but nothing's come of that yet. The occupation authorities were also making some noise about potentially asking the Russian government to annex Kherson, which would be a much bolder move than independence, but it's not clear if even that will work, given how much obvious opposition there is on the ground. But they were at least talking about it. So that's a potential threat to keep an eye on. Let's see, as far as what they were also trying to integrate some of the occupied territories a little more. I think I talked the last time we talked about this about how what was it? Oh, payment. Yeah, they were trying to replace the hryvnia with the ruble, the Russian currency. So that was one of the ways that they were trying to integrate the occupied territories with Russia. And they were also talking about issuing passports, that is to say, Russian passports to the people in the occupied territories. So the most recent thing I read was that internet traffic in the occupied territories is now being routed through Russian ISPs, specifically through Russian servers. And that was a big deal because that traffic is going to be subject to Russian oversight. They have strict rules about and oversight of the Russian internet. So all of the censorship regime in Russia that applies to the internet is now going to be applied to Ukrainians trying to use the internet in occupied territories, which means that it's going to be harder to see anti-Russian content, reporting on the war, etc., etc. rather.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see, what was the other thing here? Oh, there was a report that retired Russian soldiers between the ages of 40 and 60 were allegedly being summoned to draft boards and offered contracts to quote unquote administer various parts of occupied Ukraine. So that suggests two things. One, they are going to try to administer the territory, at least for the short to medium term. That is to say, administer it themselves. And two, they have a shortage of personnel with which to do so. I'm sure it would be better if they could just get personnel in the FSB or one of the other intelligence agencies to do it. But the fact that they're basically begging people who are retired to come out of retirement and help them do it suggests that they're having some manpower shortages, not only in terms of infantry, but also in terms of higher level personnel with whom you might administrate, say, some occupied territory.
Chad is joking that right after that comment would have been a perfect time to announce a NordVPN sponsorship. They're controlling the information here and here. By the way, this stream is sponsored by.
Well, hey, if they go ahead.
With the administration thing, would it be like administration as in special military operation, but they're actually fighting, or administration as in for the areas that Russia had already currently controlled? They go in and they do the kind of standing around and making sure everything is happening as they want it to, but not actually like shooting guns and stuff.
Neither. I think they're actually trying to find people to fill offices of government in order to fill actual duties of government in the occupied territories.
Oh.
As is, the Russians have largely allowed the pre-existing municipalities and local governments to continue to operate. Mm-hmm. But a lot of those are very anti-Russian and have been working with Ukrainian intelligence and the Ukrainian military to try to resist Russian occupation. Mm-hmm. So they've been trying to shift away from pre-existing governments and to install their own appointed governments to occupy and govern occupied territories on their behalf. But obviously there's not a lot of takers. Most people are opposed to Russian governments. So because they're having trouble finding traitors, basically, who will work with them, they're having to resort to asking retired people in Russia to try to come out and do it for them. And like I said, I'm sure they would prefer if intelligence agents who actually literally worked for the Russian government would just fulfill that role. Mm-hmm. But there's just not enough of them, it seems. So that's the occupation news that I had. They have found some traitors. There was one woman named Nadia Antonova who ran a village near Kharkiv in the eastern Ukraine. And she was apparently giving away the identities of policemen, soldiers, and counterterrorism specialists to Russian intelligence. These are people in her area, basically, that whose identities the Russians wanted. And she also passed on the identities of local hunters and park rangers. The Russians have been after people like that as well because they have knowledge of the countryside and hence make, well, hypothetically would make good resistance fighters. So she was arrested, I believe, after her village was liberated
Wait.
from Russian occupation.
Oh, that way. Was she? You said she's Ukrainian or she's Russian?
I think she's actually ethnic Russian. I'm not sure,
Mm.
but she's in Ukrainian territory, and she was the head of a Ukrainian village.
Mm.
So she was of Ukrainian nationality.
Right.
I'm not sure about her ethnicity, but yeah, she was working with the Russians when they were occupying the village. And now that the village is back in Ukrainian hands, the Ukrainian authorities have gone after her, arrested her.
Mm. Yeah, that's one of the things that is interesting about humans in general is you're not necessarily 100% one thing or another thing. There's always kind of a gradient from one place to another. So you could be more pro-Russian or more pro-Ukrainian, but the people have lived next to each other for a long time, so there's going to be a lot of overlap. But this seems like an extreme case of someone like just disclosing a bunch of information that they think would be helpful to the invading side.
Mhm.
I could see why that would be upsetting for sure.
Oh, not just upsetting, illegal, explicitly. Collaboration is punishable.
It's
I don't.
officially treason.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. They've been arresting people even in territory that's not occupied by Russians for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
There was even a video I saw. Maybe even I can't remember if I sent it to you or not, but I was watching a video where some Ukrainian special forces, well, maybe not special force, maybe Ukrainian intelligence agents, well, some kind of Ukrainian authority figures, let's say, raided an apartment, and the video was of them arresting a man who had been posting Russian propaganda and who was allegedly supporting the Russian invasion. And even that is punishable. So they have very strict laws on this in Ukraine right now.
Mm-hmm.
No surprise. It's about as clear a case of an emergency as you're likely to get, so emergency rules apply. Among them, not supporting the country invading you.
Mm-hmm.
That should go without saying, but
That makes
yeah,
sense.
there's still some people that buy the Russian narrative about the conflict. I don't think there's very many, but they still exist.
Yeah, some of the rally around the flag stuff, I've seen the propaganda is that it's about Russophobia, the world is against Russia, and this is like their place to take a stand. But that wasn't really something that was talked about by anyone before that was used as a propaganda tool. Like, I'd never even heard of the concept of people being afraid of Russians or against Russians in general, because it was one of the more dominating forces in the region.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's a line that they've used frequently over the past couple decades. It's not unheard of. But it hasn't really gained much prominence because it was kind of more the preserve of Russian politics. And people outside Russia obviously have not paid much attention to Russian politics since the end of the Cold War. People are more concerned about, the Middle East, China, Europe, but not so much Russia. So it doesn't surprise me that it hasn't gotten a lot of press that Russian nationalists complain a lot about perceived Russophobia. But they do, they have definitely done that to a considerable degree, and it's one of the rationalizations for their rather aggressive foreign policy, or at least one of them anyway.
There were some people asking in chat about connections between Koch brothers and Russia and propaganda. There was another thing that I saw personally that I'm remembering now of Rand Paul doing some stuff that definitely was beneficial to Russia. Like he objected to a few different motions. I think one of them in the past, I saw a video of John McCain talking about the only person who would oppose this would be someone who's wanting to help out Putin. And Rand Paul objected, but he didn't give a reason as to like, I think this is not a good idea because X, Y, or Z. He just objected because he can, and it slows the process down, that kind of a thing. So,
Well, I think he was complaining about a lack of oversight. Supposedly there wasn't any kind of auditing oversight over how the money was being spent. So he allegedly wanted to create such oversight, some kind of mechanism by which that could happen. I don't entirely blame him because the Pentagon basically just doesn't have any kind of what would you call it? Doesn't have any kind of official auditing mechanism. They've been notorious for that, for their inability to keep track of money. So that's kind of been a running sore point. But I think in this case, he's more just sort of grandstanding. Because he's right that there's a lack of oversight and that there should be more. But at the same time, I suspect he's just doing it so that he can get his name in the paper. One of the ways that politicians operate is by just trying to find ways to get into the news so that people back home will see them doing something. Because otherwise, if your name isn't really in the news much, then people will kind of forget about you. And then there'll be some questions about, just what are you actually doing for me? So if you can do a little grandstanding now and again, you can kind of remind constituents that you are in fact doing stuff.
Look at all this grandstanding I did for you.
Yeah. It's not necessarily substantive stuff, but you are at least pretending to be productive in your capacity as a representative of your constituents. So I think that's more what he's doing here. And it's not as though he doesn't have a history of doing that, or his father for that matter.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, I suspect what's going to happen is that they're going to give him some kind of token concession in which there's some minimal oversight mechanism put in place so that he can say that he did something and achieved something, but probably it won't be that much different than what already exists. Yeah, there's been intermittent attempts to try to have more oversight over the military's budget in the United States, just because of the lack of any real auditing. But it's never really gone anywhere. Some of that is probably due to national security concerns. You don't really want information about exactly how all of the money is being spent in great detail, just so you can deny that information to potentially hostile intelligence agencies. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily excuse the sheer lack of any real substantive auditing that's been done. There should be more, certainly. Yeah, I remember back during the Iraq War, there would be just billions of dollars that would disappear. I think one of the most notorious cases was there was a bunch of aid money that was sent over on a plane. It was actually billions of dollars in cash, and they had it all in a single cargo plane. And the cargo plane landed, and the cash was, carted off, and we don't know what happened after that because there was no tracking, there was no auditing, there was just no mechanism in place to actually track how the money was actually spent. So, as near as we can tell, that all of that billions of dollars in cash just disappeared off of that airplane.
Whoops.
So stuff like that is kind of what irks people who are looking for reform on this issue. Let's see, I had some other stuff, just some miscellaneous items here. Oh, actually, before we get to that, though, there was the U.S. Director of National Intelligence, a woman named Avril Haines, did an interview, and she kind of had some interesting details as to just what the Russian strategy is for the war. And I think the most interesting tidbit was that she mentioned that Putin thinks that the West is going to get tired and quit. And I might have mentioned that before, but I think this is the best source I've had for this. So she's saying that Vladimir Putin himself thinks that he can win the conflict just through perseverance. Just if he can just drag out the conflict, that eventually the West will get tired of all the money that they're having to spend, to say nothing of the impact of all the sanctions. And he thinks that if he can therefore last just long enough, then eventually the West will force Ukraine to sign some kind of sign some kind of agreement preferential to Russian interests. And again, very little of what the Russian government has done vis-a-vis Ukraine over the past couple months has been very realistic. And this seems to be one of them. I mean, all of the signals are that the West are treating this different than they've treated any of the other intransigences that Russia has perpetrated before. It seems like they really are going to go to the mat for Ukraine this time. So I suspect this is a misreading on the part of Putin. But if that is the case, it's going to be a very expensive misreading, because it means that the fighting is just going to drag on probably for months, if not longer, until such time as the Russian military is basically just broken, or until the Russian government finally mobilizes Russian society. And like I've mentioned before, I think somebody even asked me about it. If the Russian government did mobilize, there would be retaliation on the part of the West. I don't entirely know what, but certainly they would do something. So I don't think that would be the end of the conflict. It would just be an escalation in the conflict. Either way, though, it looks like the war is going to last probably several more months at least, if not longer. So that was kind of my reading of the significance of that comment. I also thought it was interesting that Haynes iterated, or reiterated really, that the Russian government and Vladimir Putin would only approve of the use of nuclear weapons if Russia itself was under quote unquote existential threat. And she made the point of highlighting that they would not even use tactical nuclear weapons unless they thought Russia was under existential threat. So that kind of goes back to a conversation we had before about how it's not completely unrealistic to think that the West might intervene in Ukraine, at least to a limited degree. And the argument I was making is that, if there was any hint that the Russians would not use nuclear weapons in retaliation to intervention in Ukraine, then it would become much more likely. So the fact that she's saying that suggests that the Western governments and Western intelligence agencies maybe know that nuclear weapons are not really on the table as far as a possible response to Western intervention, which suggests to me that Western intervention is much more likely than the public thinks it is. Because right now, whenever I see it discussed, it's almost written off, prima facie. Like there's no way we would intervene just because of concern over nuclear weapons. And I myself have said that. But the more I read about how averse the Russian government is to using nuclear weapons in response to intervention, the more I think it's less unlikely, at least, that intervention could happen. So I would still argue it's unlikely just because of a fear of escalation and a fear of the escalatory ladder. But the longer the conflict drags out and the more public pressure there is in the West to do something, and the worse the behavior of the Russian army, for that matter, I think the more likely it becomes. And so I don't think it's completely off the table like I did at the start of the conflict. Let's see. And then, okay, so then the miscellaneous items. There was a Russian TV schedule. You know how it is like on cable TV where you can like bring up a schedule of programming and whatnot? So you can see like what's running at what time. It's the kind of stuff that TV Guide used to do back when they had that. So that was hacked in Russia. And every program on the list was changed to display this message, quote, "On your hands is the blood of thousands of Ukrainians and their hundreds of murdered children. TV and the authorities are lying, no to war," end quote. So there's been a lot of hacking, little sort of not substantive hacks, but just sort of marginal hacks like that over the past couple months. Little things that kind of needle this, that, or the other institution. TV channels have been hacked. Obviously, cable TV was hacked. I think there was even one gas station that was hacked, such that the little display thing that shows you how much it costs or what, I don't remember exactly what it was. Maybe they just show ads normally, but the gas station terminal was hacked to display an anti-war message. So just lots of little hacks like that have been going on by Anonymous and their little army of hackers. They declared war on Russia basically at the start of the conflict, and they've been perpetrating hacks like this ever since. I think some of the more substantive stuff they've done is to hack into Russian government institutions and release lists of private information of people who work for those institutions. I think there's been two such major hacks that have happened since the start of the conflict in that vein.
And for Anonymous, this is a group that's been around for a bit, but it's not like a hierarchical group where you have a designated leader and they have offices and stuff like this. It's sort of anyone can take up the name of Anonymous, but they're just internet people who have opinions and they want to do stuff with their hacking skills.
Yeah. Yeah, that's pretty much all volunteer.
Mm-hmm.
I think they organize online somewhere, maybe on Tor or something. I don't know. But yeah, they've got some organization. They've got like a list of tasks that they are requesting that people fulfill. So some of the people who are not as skilled basically can do some of the lower level stuff, and then the more complicated stuff is kind of being reserved for insiders.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. And then I had this, which I just thought was kind of funny, and it just illustrates how bad operational security is in the Russian army. Um, a lot of Russians still have their SIM cards in their phones, and that means that it's actually really easy for telecommunications firms to track them. And they actually made a map. So there's actually a heat map showing, where the Russian SIM cards are in Ukraine, and by extension, concentrations of Russian forces. So I thought that was pretty funny, and I actually had the link to the map here. I'll send it to you.
For the purposes of military security, you would want to make sure all your personnel basically have burner phones or at least like work phones that are not personal phones.
Well, you would rather not have them. You would rather them not have phones at all. You would
Oh.
rather have your own proprietary encrypted communications system that they could use instead.
Hmm.
But that system isn't working. It's had problems because they destroyed the 3G tower. Yeah, what was it? The 3G towers that they're no 4G. So they had an encrypted communication system, but it depended on 4G towers being operational, and they dismantled those
Right.
when
I
they
think I
invaded.
remember us talking about this before.
Yeah. And so the system doesn't work, and so they had to default to unsecure communication systems like smartphones and whatnot. Oh, hang on, I did that wrong. Let me. There we go. That's the second one. Oh, yeah, there it is. It pops up with the picture there. So let's see, there's that. And it probably won't surprise you to know that Russia is having to substitute for foreign computer chips because they've been cut off from the supply of foreign computer chips. So they've been having to make their own or find them from other sources. And I thought this was interesting. Supposedly, they're using computer chips from home appliances in order to repair military hardware due to the lack of their normal supply of computer chips. And supposedly, some of those computer chips that they're using are coming from washing machines.
Hmm.
So I don't know if that's true. That sounds a little propaganda to me, but it's believable in the sense that they have the shortage of computer chips and are having to salvage them wherever they can get them. I wouldn't think that computer chips from washing machines would be interchangeable with the kinds that you use in military equipment, because I think they're specialized, basically. But it's worth pointing out that these are the kinds of things you can expect to see them doing in the future as they try to basically scrounge up whatever supplies of computer chips among other electronics that they can find. Washing machines have popped up a lot in this conflict. They kept stealing them. Like they were weirdly fixated on washing machines. They stole other stuff too, but washing machines in particular.
They
The Russian
oh,
soldiers invading Ukraine.
they're taking the washing machines of Ukraine.
Yeah, they loot them. I think Zelensky even commented on it. It's one of the funnier, one of his funnier comments on the
It's
war.
kind of a big item to loot.
Oh, They found them on trucks, like the trucks that they were blowing up in the early part of the war. Some of them had washing machines that they'd stolen on them.
Wow.
They were trying to
It
take
it
them
is
back to
true.
camp.
It is true that having like a in-unit washer and dryer is a big selling point for an apartment. So maybe it's people who don't have that. They're like, you know what? Going to the laundromat sucks. While we're here, there's a washing machine. Why don't we just take that? That's pretty
You know,
silly.
one of the insults Zelensky had was, well, there's this old saying in Russia, right? I don't remember it verbatim, but basically the gist of it was, the Russian dream is to visit Paris and then die. And Zelensky was saying that the new Russian dream is to steal a washing machine and die. It's a pretty good burn. Let's see. Oh, also, the Russians have been leaving. Well, we talked before about how the Russians evacuated the north of Ukraine, right? Because they were just losing, and so they wanted to economize their forces and redeploy them to eastern Ukraine.
Mhm.
So one of the things that they apparently did before leaving is booby trapping some of the stuff in some of the civilian houses that they've been in. So there was a guy in the city of Bucha where there had been heavy fighting who noticed that some of the awards on the top of his piano had been placed incorrectly. And that apparently saved the life of his daughter because when he inspected it, he found out that there was a mine inside the piano.
Whoa.
Yeah. So booby traps like that apparently have not been uncommon in some of the houses that have been occupied by Russian troops. So just more casual war crimes, basically. Okay, I think that's all I had for Ukraine then. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it.
Hmm.
Before I forget again, now is a good, well, maybe not a good time, but the usual disclaimer. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. So if I ever say anything that's wrong, stupid, or biased, please do correct me. If I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. So, I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it later. I can't really walk and chew bubble gum at the same time. So participation is encouraged in that regard.
He reads the VOD chat on Twitch and then the YouTube comments as well. So if you have any input from where you live, any personal stories, or if we got something dead wrong, feel free to just fire back and let us know how it is.
Yeah, we want to hear from you. And you can also email me if you want. My email is johntx1848@gmail.com,
And
I believe.
it's in the who is it command as well. So if you
Yeah.
type ! Who is it, you can see it in the chat.
Yeah, so let me know what's what. I've got some standing correspondence with a couple of you now. I think principally Dagnip, Dagnip and Etche Fatum being the principal cases in an example. But was there any other big topic you wanted to touch on rather? I don't think we talked about the abortion stuff at all.
Oh, right. Yeah. I didn't really figure too much about what that was about. It seemed like it was some correspondence with Supreme Court people that was leaked, but it wasn't like an official change that was being pushed through per se.
So there were two things that happened, and the more famous of them is the draft. There was a draft opinion that had been written by the Supreme Court justices, and that was leaked.
Mm-hmm.
And the contents of that draft suggest that there's a majority opinion on the court sufficient to overturn Roe v. Wade as part of a case involving abortion that involves Mississippi. Mississippi passed a law trying to ban abortion after 15 weeks, I believe it was, which is lower than the number of weeks which is more intrusive than the established rules had historically allowed, the established precedent had allowed. I think the established precedent is that you can't ban it any earlier than 24 weeks. Somebody more familiar with that, please correct me.
That's the time within the pregnancy when you can get an abortion.
Yeah. You can't have an abortion after 15 weeks of pregnancy, according to the law that Mississippi passed. And, conservative anti-abortion states pretty frequently pass laws like this, and they're generally almost always shot down by the Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court has a pretty, steady stream of these, basically.
Hmm.
But what's new this time is that this court seems to be taking the opportunity to not only rule that the law should stand, but also that the established precedent established by Roe v. Wade should be overturned because they think that the ruling involved was incorrect. And that's a simplification, but that's the gist of it. And that's what's got everybody so excited.
Hmm.
Now, the draft leak was one leak, but there's actually been other leaks as well. Basically, a number of newspapers have been receiving information from people involved in the process, probably clerks for one or the other Supreme Court justices. And they've been informing the newspapers about the opinion and the fact that there could be an overturning of Roe v. Wade. So that's probably more substantive than the draft. The draft could change. Like that's why it's a draft and not a final opinion. But the fact that there's people within the Supreme Court as an institution who are doing the leaks suggests that there's, much something more substantive at work here. It's worth noting too that it's highly unprecedented in the modern era for leaks like this to happen. Normally the Supreme Court is very buttoned down, it's very insular. They do their thing, they're very professional, and then that's it. So the fact that there's leaks being made to the press and that that the ruling has become a political football shows just how controversial this is and how sensitive an issue this is. And also that the Supreme Court as an institution seems to be increasingly politicized. In general, I've argued against the idea that the Supreme Court has become politicized because most of the people with legal backgrounds who I've read comment on the Supreme Court as an institution have argued that generally the concern within the Supreme Court is not politicization, but rather perception of politicization. But this seems to be a little different this time because this really seems like an attempt by the court to really reach. That's not to say that the opinion outlined in the draft leak, in the leak to draft rather, is not substantive. Like there is merits to the argument against Roe v. Wade, and there really has been for a long time. But in this case, they seem to be leaning on historical precedent. Basically, to get into some of the details here, I've read a little bit about it. Roe v. Wade and the ruling therein rested mostly on the 14th Amendment, which allegedly, implicitly, provides a right to privacy. And that right is provided by way of what's called the Due Process Clause. So the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment guarantees people the right to due process. And normally, officially, and very explicitly, that protects your right to procedural, to proper procedure within the context of a court case. So, if there's like some kind of violation of normal procedure, then then you could cite the 14th Amendment in order to have your court case basically canceled or redone. You can tell I'm not a lawyer here. My apologies for not being super familiar with the proper terminology, but that's my understanding of it. So that's normally what the due process clause, that's officially, explicitly what the due process clause is meant to protect. But it can also be meant to protect other things. For example, it can be used to protect a right to privacy. Now, there's no right to privacy explicitly outlined in the Constitution, but there are other things in the Constitution that can be related to, that could be inferred to protect a right to privacy. So, for example, your protection from any government attempt to force you to house soldiers in your house, combined with some of the other, amendments and clauses. I don't have the list in front of me and I don't have it memorized, but based on the weight of the evidence, based off of the combined protections in other laws, you can infer a right to privacy. So the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment protects that right to privacy as inferred from other protections. So there's a third way that the Due Process Clause can be applied here, and this is the important one. So this is what's called substantive due process. And the issue with substantive due process is that it's super ambiguous. Because here you're sort of 2 degrees removed from explicitly written law. Again, with the procedural protection, that's explicit. And with the right to privacy, that's kind of inferred based off of other rights. But in the case of substantive due process, you're kind of interpreting the law based off of law based off of rights that you're kind of interpreting into the law. It's more ambiguous. At least that's the way I was reading it described. And so that was how Roe v. Wade was decided. They used substantive due process to infer that the right to privacy protects women's right to an abortion. And that was always controversial. And really, anytime substantive due process is invoked as a protection, as protecting a given right, that's pretty much always been controversial throughout the legal history of the United States. So one of the examples I read was that one application of substantive due process around the early 20th century involved the Supreme Court striking down labor protections because the Supreme Court inferred, by way of substantive due process, that people have a right to free association, which they perceived to have been violated by labor protection laws that had been passed. And so that was hugely controversial, obviously. And the Supreme Court sort of recognized that later on and wrote in a later ruling that they would recognize that they needed to use substantive due process less. And so for about 50 years, you didn't really see substantive due process used much by the Supreme Court. But then that, of course, changed with the civil rights movement and some of the laws that ended up being changed in relation to that. So, well, I should specify this: the Supreme Court in the 1950s and 60s issued a number of rulings that were very favorable to the civil rights movement that overturned a number of longstanding rulings. Among them, the ruling that overturned Plessy v. Ferguson and Little Rock, for example, which allowed integration of schools. So that Supreme Court overturned a lot of that, and some of that was overturned using substantive due process argumentation. But substantive due process argumentation was much more important for stuff that happened in more the 60s and the 70s that was not related to the civil rights movement. Stuff like Roe v. Wade, for example, but also more recently, for example, I don't remember all of the cases specifically, but the cases that overturned Texas sodomy laws. It was inferred that you have a right to basically a homosexual relationship. And also, some of it is slipping my mind. I would have to dig through my notes. But there's been a number of rulings that have basically recognized rights as being protected that were not recognized in earlier eras. And pretty much all of those over the past 40 to 50 years were predicated on due process, substantive due process invocation. So for the Supreme Court here, and well, to kind of skip ahead a little bit, the significance of of substantive due process here is that the court here in their draft is arguing that substantive due process was basically overextended in the case of Roe v. Wade, and that based off of that assumption that Roe v. Wade was a incorrect ruling and should be overturned. That's kind of the gist of it as I understand it. Again, this is not a lawyer's understanding. This is my attempt to understand it from a layman's perspective.
To put it in simple terms, it sounds like they're arguing that it took too many inferences to get to that point based on other sorts of rules and stuff. So it's not like a super direct, this is obviously a personal freedom that should exist. This is by inference a personal freedom that should exist.
Yeah.
And that's not convincing enough, which is why they're talking about evaluating that.
Yeah.
I guess my follow-up question is why now? Like what would be the reason that would bring it into question at this point? Because you said there have been a bunch of different laws that have tried to go through in the past, and they've always struck it down.
Yeah, so that's the issue. So the Supreme Court here in their draft goes out of their way to try to highlight circumstances in which precedent can be overturned.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not as though precedent is utterly sacrosanct. You know, in a common law system, precedent is normally pretty much how you judge everything. Like it's super important to how you judge cases. But there have been examples of precedent being overturned. So, for example, the aforementioned changes to civil rights legislation, interpretation of the law in favor of civil rights, you know, extending the franchise, protecting the franchise of African American voters, for example. Those are examples of precedent being overturned because it had been pretty thoroughgoing thoroughgoing precedent that that oppression and suppression of the African American vote was legal and allowed. So ending that, inherently required overturning precedent. And
Mm-hmm.
that involved basically criticizing the original ruling on which the precedent had been based
Mm-hmm.
and challenging that as incorrect within some context. So that's what they're doing here. They're saying that this is established precedent and normally we would rule according to it, but we think the original ruling was incorrect, so we're going to challenge it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, you could go further and ask why this Supreme Court is challenging that, well, where other Supreme Courts have not. And the answer is that they basically just have the majority now.
Mm.
And I would have thought that they would have averred on that just out of professionalism. But it seems like they're making a Hail Mary pass here.
Right, because you said before that it's usually not a politicized institution.
Yeah.
How many justices are there, and how many would you say that are like clearly right leaning now?
Samuel Alito is probably the most right-leaning. He's the one that kind of comes up a lot in the criticisms I've read of the draft. And probably Amy Cohen Barrett, also fairly conservative, or at least she's perceived as such. Roberts is kind of more wishy-washy. He's kind of an institutional guy.
Mm-hmm.
And actually that it's kind of hard to interpret just who is conservative and who's not in that context. Because one of the reasons that I've read that the leaks happened is that people in the court are trying to pressure Roberts into not defecting. That was one of the more interesting theories that I read. So I think people heard about the leaks and just assumed that it was actually liberal clerks who leaked it in order to try to galvanize the public and try to organize resistance to the ruling. But actually, what I've read is that the general theory, the general consensus amongst journalists, is that the leakers are conservatives on the Supreme Court. And the theory as to why they would leak that information is that they think that Roberts might himself, and also maybe another justice that he convince, change his mind. Because as of the draft, he was in favor of overturning Roe v. Wade.
Mm-hmm.
But he's also changed his opinion before on controversial cases in order to protect the court from perceptions of political bias, or at least that's the allegation. It's difficult to prove. But so it could be that conservatives on the court want to put Roberts in a box. Because as is, he might have changed his mind and voted against overturning Roe v. Wade to protect the court.
Mm-hmm.
But now that this leak has been made, there could be allegations, if he does change his mind, that he changed his mind because of public pressure.
Mm.
And that would also make the court look politicized. So at this point, he's damned if he does and damned if he doesn't. Like, there's nothing he can do in terms of voting for or against Roe v. Wade that isn't going to make the court look politicized. So this option is off the table for him. So the theory that I read is that this is why the leaks happened, in order to try to prevent Roberts from potentially defecting from his initial judgment.
Huh.
Again, that's speculation. It's kind of hard to prove one way or the other. But that would at least explain why the leakers are conservatives on the court and not liberals, whom you would intuitively think they would be.
Mm-hmm.
It's all pretty weird. And again, it's unprecedented in the modern era for this to happen. Like, leaks just don't happen from the Supreme Court. This is the first time it's happened in decades. I've read that it actually used to be very common in the 1700s, well, in the 1800s, late 1700s, and I think maybe early 20th century. So during that period, it was pretty normal for leaks like this to happen. But since the mid 20th century, at least, it's pretty much unheard of. Like, you don't see this happening. So there's a lot of weirdness going on the Supreme Court right now. And that suggests that there is something unprecedented happening.
Yeah, it seems
Now,
like a security problem.
oh, yeah, it's being investigated as such. Like, the government is already trying to look into who did it. It's seen as an attempt to try to involve the public in a ruling, which is kind of a big no-no in terms of court rulings. Like, it's supposed to be a very professional, austere process.
Mm-hmm.
It's not really supposed to involve political considerations. But now it's very much involving political considerations. So we're very much in uncharted territory here.
Yeah, it's sort of like revealing something before it's really been deliberated on and polished, and then they've basically covered their bases of explaining their position and making it ready for the public and so on.
Yeah.
I don't have anything that's of this caliber, of course. I'm not a Supreme Court justice or anything, but I definitely understand the difference between like a brainstorming session and like polishing an idea and getting it ready to launch session with like guild leadership and also just content creation, that kind of a thing. Sometimes you just speak your mind and say, what if we did this? And you're just thinking about different random shit at that point. You're not like ready to go with everything. And if you just said that all the time, then people would either get really excited or disappointed pretty often. It's usually better to kind of do your planning stage privately and figure out, okay, maybe I want to do this move, maybe I don't. And then once it's ready to go, then you can actually ship it.
Yeah, that seems to be what's happening here. It was a premature release, I guess.
Mm.
But the question is why? Why release it prematurely like that? Like, we don't really know that. It's all just strange, and nobody quite entirely knows how to interpret it. There's been attempts, but nobody knows for sure yet. But I kind of go back to the logic behind the draft ruling as it's written. Um, again, like I said before, like substantive due process has always been controversial, so it's not necessarily a surprise that that's being cited as an issue. But I think the logic is much weaker when they kind of get into the details there. Specifically, one of the sort of barometers by which you can judge whether or not substantive due process is warranted is whether or not a given right that the protection of which is being debated is quote unquote deeply rooted in the nation's history and tradition. So that's one measure. And so in the draft, that's actually cited. They say that abortion is not rooted in the nation's history and tradition. That is not a a right to a abortion is not a protected right according historically and traditionally. So that's really the weakest part of the argumentation, because historically, women were not allowed to vote. So how could you have a tradition like that if women were not active participants in the political process?
Mm-hmm.
So that's a major point of consternation there amongst the criticisms that I've read of the ruling. I guess you could counter that even at that time, before women were allowed to vote, women themselves were very conservative. So you could say it's a moot point in that sense. But even so, I think it's a bit of a stretch to cite historical circumstance as being a justification here. Obviously, things change over time. And so if circumstances had been different, there probably would have been a right and protection for abortion. And certainly at this point, for the past 50 years, it's certainly become assumed that there is a right to, the right to an abortion is protected. So I think if the opinion, as it's written in the draft, falls apart, and it's still possible that the final ruling could be different than what the draft suggests it was. Again, it's not a final decision is not expected yet. So if it's going to be different, I suspect the principal issue will be that. Substantive due process criticism is totally justified. That criticism of Roe v. Wade is warranted, but to cite historical and historic history and tradition as being the barometer there, that's kind of where the issue is going to be.
Mm-hmm.
So we'll see. It's there's a lot of drama over this, and obviously there's significant political ramifications. One theory I read is that the leakers just wanted to influence the midterm elections in order to try to mobilize Democrats, but that of course doesn't explain why the leakers would be conservative. So I'm a little skeptical of that, but that's a possibility anyway. At this point you can't rule it out. At the very least, the Supreme Court as an institution has been damaged.
Mm-hmm.
I think that at least we can conclude at this point. And that's another democratic institution in the United States that has been damaged. It's part of a long conga line of such institutions that have been damaged over the past 10 years, which is not ideal.
Yeah, faith in institutions, I think, has been one of the major points that made the world see the U.S. as a stabilizing force in some ways, or at least predictable and stable economically. So if we dislike our legislature, we dislike our executive, and we dislike our Supreme Court, that's minus on all three of our branches of government. And I think the Supreme Court was probably the one that has made the least amount of noise in terms of upsetting people for a while. Until
Yeah, I mean,
now.
well, I mean, it definitely upset people in the mid 20th century because there was a lot of people opposed to extending rights to, say, African Americans,
Hmm.
as well as extending other rights that are now protected, but which had not been previously. So certainly people on the right have had a lot of bones to pick with the Supreme Court over the past half century.
Hmm.
And now, though, that the shoe is on the other foot, it seems that the left is also going to turn on the Supreme Court. So that means that the Supreme Court is basically without any kind of supporting constituency. And that's probably going to be bad for the health of the US system as a whole, but it's also going to be bad as far as the legitimacy of court rulings going forward. Because, again, it's going to be really hard to argue that this is not, that this ruling, if it does happen, the overturning of Roe v. Wade is not the court really trying to stretch logic here. It's worth mentioning too in the draft that they explicitly highlight Roe v. Wade in a way that excludes other rights. So,
Hmm.
for example, the substantive due process logic that was used in order to extend protections to other rights, including, the right to an abortion, among others. Uh, if you're going to strike down Roe v. Wade, you could use that same logic to strike down all these other laws.
Hmm.
But in the Supreme Court draft, they explicitly mention that abortion is special. They say that it's different than these other rights that have been protected over the past 50 years. And that suggests, I mean, that's a good thing if you want to protect those other rights, because some people have said, the Supreme Court is going after abortion, what are they going to go after next? But if they do use this logic that abortion is special, that actually makes it less likely that they're going to go after the other rights.
Hmm.
So those other rights could actually be protected, continue to be protected. You know, maybe not, remains to be seen. But anyway, that's what the logic suggests. But uh, the fact that they do make it special, the downside of that is that it suggests that they are really just reaching for abortion specifically here.
Hmm.
And, it would almost be better for the institution if they didn't do that. Because at least if they did not do that, and if they did go after the other rights, they would be consistent. But as is, it looks like they've just laser-like focused. They're just laser-like focused on overturning Roe v. Wade. And that makes it really hard to argue that the court is not being political here.
Hmm.
It could still be that they're being professional. I mean, again, there are merits to the argumentation they're making. But the fact that they're just homing in on abortion specifically kind of says that that's not necessarily the case. So there's going to be a lot of fallout to that. And I don't know how you fix that. Like, if the court's rulings are considered illegitimate, there's going to be a significant pushback against that legislatively. There's going to be a big push to reform the institution. But I don't even know how you could reform the institution in a way that's bipartisan at this point. So that means it's probably not going to happen, which means we're probably just going to be stuck with a court that the public hates for the foreseeable future.
Hmm.
So that's going to augur probably some degree of instability politically in the United States, which is not really what we need right now, but it seems like what we're going to get. So have fun with that.
Yeah.
Exciting times ahead.
Yeah.
Are we doing okay on time?
Yep, we started a little bit late, but I'm in a match right now. It's pretty scuffed. They went for the invisible units, but I just killed 2 of their bases worth of stuff, so it's kind of like one of those samurai sequences where they both charge at each other and slash through, and one person falls over. The question is, who's going to fall over?
Well, if Roe v. Wade is overturned, there's going to be a lot of fallout because a lot of red states have trigger laws, that are going to automatically ban abortion if
Mm-hmm.
Roe v. Wade is overturned. So there will be a pretty significant change to the legal landscape in the United States almost overnight.
Mm-hmm.
And the big question for me is the degree to which the pro-choice crowd is going to organize in response.
Mm-hmm.
So certainly abortions, well, for one, uh, the trigger laws are not going to punish women for getting abortions. They're going to punish abortion providers. Those are the targets. So the question then becomes, how can you get around that if you want if you want an abortion?
Mm-hmm.
So one way to do that is to send pills via mail. So that looks like the next logical legal battle to be waged.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, if you're sending people abortion pills by mail within a state in which abortion is illegal, then you're violating those laws and they're going to come after you. But what if you're in California? Does that still count? Like, no, it shouldn't. But there are states that are going to try, most likely, to establish anti-abortion laws as extraterritorial laws. And that's going to create a lot of state versus state legal tension. That's going to result in a lot of legal wrangling. And there's also probably going to be a lot of NGOs that start operating clandestinely to try to help women get abortions. I almost wonder if getting an abortion might not be cheaper, given that now abortions are not going to be subject to taxation and regulation. So they may actually be more freely available, albeit significantly more dangerous. I'm just curious how NGOs will respond. There should be a way to help women get abortions if they need them in secret. And I would imagine that there'll be a lot of effort invested in trying to do that. But that also suggests to me that there's going to be a corresponding effort by conservative states to try to enforce the law and counter that, which means that we could actually have abortion police or abortion investigators in conservative states, which I'm sure people will be very excited by, both for and against. That's itself going to be a major political football if it comes to that.
It's definitely been a major sticking point issue for a long time.
Yeah, certainly. But a lot of conservatives who are against abortion have been in well, I should say conservative leaders, especially conservative politicians who oppose abortion, have been in the rather privileged position of being able to pass laws to ban abortion, knowing that they'll be shot down and that they won't actually have to do anything to stop them.
Mm-hmm.
Now they've lost that. Now they're actually going to have to do something to enforce abortion laws if indeed Roe v. Wade is overturned. And that being the case, how far do you go? And what realistically can you do to actually stop it?
Mm-hmm.
So those are going to be thorny problems for them. And I'm sure they're going to come under a lot of criticism, not only from people on the left for abusing women, basically, from their perspective, but also a lot of criticism from people on the right for not going far enough. For the most radical anti-abortion actors, abortion is murder, and they think the state should expend all resources necessary in order to not only prevent it from happening, but to punish people for allowing it to happen and for propagating it.
Mm-hmm. And then for the left, it's an issue of women's rights and what they decide they can do with their body.
Mm-hmm.
Because pregnancy is a very major life event that is a huge cost to the person who's carrying the child. And then it's also a major investment both in your time and energy after the child is born.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, I think one of the things that it's boiled down to a lot of the time is when does it count as life that needs to be protected per se? Because there are a lot of situations where, say, there's a stillborn child and that kind of thing that happens just naturally, unfortunately. And there's also the potential for pregnancy. So deciding when a fetus is granted certain rights and protections has been the question mark. And I think like the date about when an abortion can be made is a thing. And then also the context of the pregnancy is another one that I think is another point of conversation for people of, was this a planned pregnancy or not? Was this one that involved consent or not? Because stuff like that is a really major factor in, I think, what people's opinions are and that kind of a thing. But yeah, it's certainly one that I feel like has caused us, whenever the conversation comes up, to often move to the poles of the political spectrum rather than to try to meet in the middle somewhere and kind of talk about what freedoms and rights people should have. I hope we can figure it out and be adults about it.
That's not going to happen.
Yeah, bear in mind we're two men trying to talk about this issue too. So if you have any opinions about this and you have greater context and experience or people you know about and we got some of the stuff wrong, feel free to share.
Yeah.
I myself don't have the the physiology to grapple with this as an issue for myself as an individual, but I realize that it's a massively important issue for people. So it's definitely one worth talking about. Appreciate you helping us discuss it, Mr. Agent Smith. We've had some heckin' dicey issues lately. It's been interesting. We've had war, and then now we have abortion stuff that we're talking about. There were some periods of Agent Smith discussion where we kind of show up and be like, yo, what's up? What's been going on? Not much, really. We just kind of have a week where it's like, let's pick a point in history and talk about that. And now it's like, super intense topics, bow, bow, sirens going off.
Yeah, 2019 had different vibes to it. It's kind of a slow news year. Then everything blew up in 2020, and it's been on fire ever since.
Yeah. Did anyone do North Korea today? Yeah, we didn't mention that. We're kind of winding down here, but from what I saw, there was an unnamed disease that apparently a bunch of people were afflicted by in North Korea. From what I read around, it seems like it's probably the Omicron variant of COVID, which is a lot more contagious. They said maybe some of the motives for this would be for them to get more aid and that kind of a thing. But from what I could tell, the North Korea isn't like completely closed off. It's more of a muddy border, especially on the China side, where there are people who go to and from one place to another, and they're not like perfectly airtight and watertight in terms of diseases spreading and that kind of a thing. So it's likely that North Korea did get COVID from China. And they don't have vaccination and stuff the same as a lot of other countries do, so it's going to just kind of hit them full force.
Probably. It was notable that they admitted they had COVID at all, because they'd been denying it for years. So that's a pretty significant change for them. We'll see what they do with it. Probably won't matter that much. I doubt the North Korean government really gives a shit. I'm sure all of the leading officials in the party are all vaccinated, so they'll probably be fine.
China saying, didn't we all get it from China? Yeah, well, you know what I mean. I mean, for this variant this time, they have a border specifically.
Yeah. Yeah, if China were not taking it so seriously, they probably wouldn't care as much in the North Korean government. But you can't really pick your neighbors, can you?
You cannot.
Well, thank you for having me on. It's always a privilege. Much appreciated.
Heck yeah.
Thank everybody for listening and putting up with me.
Appreciate you, chat, for helping us out, too. Big ups, big ups. Let us know if there's anything that we got wrong or if you have anything nice to add. And we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yeah. Thanks again. See you next time.
20-minute walk. Oh! Did he leave the chat right before I said that? Oh, man. I thought I was going to get him at the end. Over 300 listeners this week. Yes. And that's a wrap.